And we're back. Hopefully you guys had a good lunch. We're gonna continue where we kind of left. Let me actually go back to the previous slide real quick. So the point is that discovery is slow and it takes time, especially when you do internal reconnaissance, because it's time consuming, especially depending on the size of the organization that you're targeting. You should also never underestimate Active Directory misconfiguration abuse, such as nested group. We come across so many cases where they had nested group inside of other groups that led to users having unexpected privilege. Managed by delegated account, unconstrained delegation and all that stuff is quite useful. The reality is not always easy to exploit it, but it's there. User account with SPN. Usually SPN should not be used for privilege account, but for some reason there's still a company that have domain admin account with SPN. SPN, for those of you that are not familiar, are also tied to Kerberos attack, where you can actually request a ticket for a specific user. The ticket is actually encrypted depending on the algorithm, either RC4 or ES, and the thing is the key is actually calculated based on the password, so you can attack them offline if you want. And speaking of that, I always wanted to spend time on it, but remember when I talked about encryption with XOR yesterday? Technically, RC4 is a stream cipher, and the ticket is kind of a known plain text. There's part of it that are predictable, so you could probably extract the key stream out of it. Not that it's any useful, but I'm wondering if there's ways, because I know that there's theoretical attack where you can actually retrieve the key from the key stream, but they're not 100% reliable. But I know there's theory about it, so that would be nice to actually try to come up to find a way to attack it, especially if it's RC4. Anyway, that's kind of off the topic, but if you are interested in taking a look at it, that may be an interesting path. NetBIOS too, unfortunately, a lot of companies still have it. They always claim that they have one application somewhere that needs it, but to be fair, we all know that it's not true. ADCS, this is something that was overlooked in the past because it was not well known and documented, but there's tons of stuff that you can abuse in there. And RPC is the beauty of Microsoft, in my opinion. This is where all the loot is, and there's much more to be discovered, and I'll kind of give you some pointers on how you can discover stuff in there. Excessive administrative privileges. If you have local user, you're usually in a good position to do all kind of stuff. And secure network share. People love to share all kind of stuff, including Excel document with passwords. As I pointed out, if you can get to Citrix profile or any application that have any sort of profiling, or I've seen a case where they also mess up the permission for the users. Usually in the main controller, you're going to have like a folder per user, but for some reason, we came across a case where all of these were actually readable by anyone, so you can actually read anyone else's folders. So what they consider to be their little secret was actually accessible by all the other users. Service account with weak password. This is especially interesting if you have SPN, because SPN are easy to get but not necessarily easy to crack depending on the password strength, right? They're literally protected by the strength of the password. Never expiring password too. They're interesting because most of the time these accounts have extremely old password, and password policy did not necessarily apply when they were created. One case that comes to mind is a case where I used Mimikatz to dump a password on the main controller, and the password was only 3 characters. Like, what the hell, there must be a bug, but this password was so old that it didn't even have like a password policy in place when it was set, but 20 years later it was still the same. It was never changed. So the truth is, you will have never find that password using password spreader or anything like that, because it was so weak that you'll never assume that it is the password, right? It's like there's people joking about the fact that if you have an account and the password is like 1, you're never going to crack it, because most people rely on dictionary attack, and they don't even bother trying to brute force password with 1 character, especially if you're doing it with password spring, where you're limited with the amount of password that you can try. But it's pretty common to still find, password with capital P and a 1 at the end, or password with an @ sign or something like that for a service account. So if you're targeting only those services, maybe you want to do different password spraying, right? One for the users and one for those legacy old account. It's always surprising. Same goes with legacy system, right? They're legacy on so many levels. They're legacy from a technology perspective, but also, I'm just going to mute you, Unleash, because you're not muted. Legacy system also mean that you probably have legacy password in there. and legacy configuration and legacy system usually were not designed to be secure, so it may be easy to access them. Most of the Active Directory out there were actually created in the early 2000s. This is something important to keep in mind because if you actually created a Active Directory recently, you're not going to have any of those activated, but assume that most of the time it is going to be activated just because it's old. Perfect example of that is NTLM v1. This is an attack that people tend to overlook for one reason. They just assume that it's not going to be there because 2016 servers does not have it, but the reality is they probably have backward compatibility in their settings. Just a quick question related to service account that may have weak password. Have you seen org using Honey canary creds more often? Yes, especially with curb roasting as the honeypot account. They're fairly easy to spot. Usually the last logon and that kind of stuff is extremely bogus. So you'll figure out that it doesn't make any sense. Same goes with Mimikatz. Sometimes you'll see honeypot credentials in memory, but they don't have a login time, or the login time doesn't really make any sense. We're like, yeah, these were obviously stuff in memory. But I'm not sure that honeypotting people is really helpful, but I guess it's a way to detect stuff. Anyone has recommendation on Hashcat rules or info on cracking long password? To be honest with you, I'm really probably the worst person when it comes to cracking. I had the chance to work with people that actually enjoy doing this, and they came up with crazy rules, but I know that there's a bunch of really interesting rules. If I remember correctly, I think that core logic Hashcat rules used to be pretty decent. They actually run like a cracking password contest or something like that. I know that these are a bit old, but on that, I know that NSA rules were also quite useful. You know, the good old raw queue and permutation. I think the key is really just permutation and all that stuff. But CRT course had a good piece on how to do special rules. I guess it also depends on your organization that you're targeting, right? If the organization that you're targeting have like a 20 character long policy, it's going to take a bit of more work to actually get where you want to go. So once again, it really depends on that, and you can adapt it, but I'm honestly not the best person to answer your question when it comes to cracking password. There's people that are much more qualified than me, and I don't know if the CRTO Rust and Mouse class have anything public about that, but if there's a link, feel free to actually hey, crack, here it is. So I guess that's probably no link, just in the course. Got it. Yeah, okay, figured. Anyway, but yeah, I guess you can always attend a Rust and Mouse class. Most of the time this content is really great, so you'll probably learn a thing or two in there. That being said, as I was mentioning, these domains are usually old, so it's not really surprising to see net NTLM v1 being enabled. The reason why I'm saying this is that NTLM v1 is actually really nice because you can crack it with Rainbow Table. Instead of having the password, you're going to recover the NT hash of the user, and that's why you can actually attack it with Rainbow Table. The major difference between net NTLM v1 and 2 is one of them contain the password, the other one contain the hash. Because you're limited on the amount of outcome because it's hash, you can always attack it with Rainbow Table, and the other one is using a slightly different algorithm which cannot be attacked with Rainbow Table. It's especially interesting when it comes to Pitspatam and exploit like that, where you may actually capture a net NTLM v2 and trying to relay it or anything like that, but if there's no ADCS or nothing to relay it to, well, just get the NTLM v1 and get the NT hash and pass the hash back. And the beauty of it is if you crack the hash and you initialize the authentication, doesn't matter if they have SMB signed and enabled or not, you're still going to be able to do it because you're the one initializing the request. Keep in mind that that's also a misconception. SMB signed do not prevent pass the hash. It's just preventing relaying the hash. Password stored in reversible algorithm, that's a functionality that Windows offer you. You may actually have password stored a reversible way that can actually be decrypted. Not sure why it was designed like that, but the truth is if there is any password stored like that, you can always get them back. SPN account, once again, you may have super old SPN account that have values, even if they're not necessarily in use anymore, but they may still be active. And GPPs, These were the group policy file that actually have some passwords. So back then, if you wanted to force a password on a local system, you can use a GPO and push the password. It was encrypted in the GPO, but the key was known. Obviously, it makes sense because it was a symmetric encryption, so source and destination need to actually know the key. It was publicly available on Microsoft website. And LDAP attribute, like the user password, which tend to be there because of legacy application and stuff like that. So these are all the stuff that you can still look for. Even if it looks old and legacy stuff, you're still going to be able to find it most of the time. During a red team, you can use pretty much the same tool set, just in a different array. A perfect example of that, Ping Castle, right? It can be used to gather LDAP misconfiguration information. It's actually .NET. So if you were not in a red team engagement, you could just run it, drop it on the system. But the fact that it's .NET, you can actually run it using execute assembly, which is quite nice, right? You can gather the information out of it without having to really bother dropping anything on this. So quick example here. Classic way to run it, cmd.exe, you just run it. Red team tells your way, execute assembly. You just specify the path on your own local system. And even more stealthy way is to actually use the buff execute assembly. The difference between execute assembly and the buff one is that the buff one is actually going to create a buff instance that pretty much hack as execute assembly, but without creating a sacrificial process, so there's no process injection involved at all, but you're going to achieve the same. The context of execution matter. Keep in mind that they also EDR improved their detection based on correlation between events. This is a perfect example where they actually use machine learning to actually mystify that there's something's going on. As you can see here, the alert says that beginning to a rare and suspicious domain. So this one was actually just considered to be malicious because a process was issuing a lot of connectivity to 88, 135, 445, and all that stuff. If you use Ping Castle and all that tool sets like Bloodhound, you may actually you may generate that kind of alert. That's why, if you can slow down your tools, you may actually get to the point where it's going to be much limited. But they could also have a honeypot domain controller, because in this case it says that beginning to a rare and suspicious domain, which is in this case it was not related to what they had internally, but it was related to the fact that the process was calling back to a website that is not really trusted, which is back to if you had a trusted known domain that was seen before, aka like domain fronting, for example, will totally fool that kind of rule set. You're going to be good to go. So domain fronting is the key to remove like beginning to a rare and suspicious domain kind of behavior. So sign out about Ping Castle. I think it's really nice, and if you can afford it, because there's technically a paid version of it, you should all buy a license. I think it's like $2,000, something like that, but it's definitely worth it. To me, it's the useful version of Bloodhound, in the sense that you'll get everything in a nice UI, so you don't have to make your own query. It pretty much did all the query for you, and it even come with a little nice HTML output that you can easily read. So this is an example of what you'll get. You'll get a comprehensive data result. So it goes through a bunch of checks, and it's actually going to score it. Not that it really matter. 99.9% of the time, you're always going to get a domain risk of 100%. But if you look at unconstrained delegation here, in this case, none of these were actually exploitable. So it's plus 85 points, but nothing can be done about it. You may also have some interesting recommendations, especially in cases where you don't find really much that is interesting. You can always report on some of the stuff, like the presence of admin account do not have the second instance of cannot be delegated. This is not extremely critical, but it's always good to have. You may also come across interesting stuff like that, that you may have not thought, like anyone can directly or remotely log into the DC, which means that you could initialize an RDP session on a domain controller. So you technically have code execution on the DC. All you need now is a privilege escalation. So this is the kind of behavior that you'll find in there. There's much more in that. It was just a sample, but usually you'll find stuff that is quite interesting. Permission, that are weak, potential curb burstable account, and much more. So if you never actually run it, I highly recommend that you actually use that and give it a try. You'll be really surprised with the result. And technically, it's all open source, but if you use it in a professional matter, you technically have to get a license. Sign-on and unconstrained delegation. To usually be able to exploit it, you'll need to have one weaknesses that is also usually reported by Pingcastle, and it's the fact that users can create up to 10 computer account. To be able to do it, you need to find a unconstrained delegation to an account or a computer that does not exist anymore. You kind of do it for yourself, so you kind of assign it to you, right? So it always needed a chain of events. So in this case, unconstrained delegation was not exploitable because all the system were actually still active. But once again, you may come across, especially older XP or 2003 server that still have delegated constraint that are actually still present in the AD, but the system doesn't exist. So you basically just says that your computer is this one by creating a computer account, matching whatever you found in there. You can always search for it using LDAP. So if you're curious to see all you have, you can always query this service principal name. So you can LDAP search and search for SPN. You'll get a list of what you have in there. Be careful of what you report. Not all the data reported is exploitable, right? That's something really important. That's what I love about Red Team. Usually, a traditional pen test, you may report all kind of stuff that the scan provided to you, but it doesn't mean it's actually really exploitable and has any value. In this case, Red Team is interesting because I tend to not report everything in all the tools that I run, just report whatever was useful to get to my goal, right? So if we kind of go back to that slide, for example, I'll probably report none of this. I remember in the specific case that I was able to actually leverage the interactive logon and remote logon to a DC as a thing because I used that to get our DP session. And I found a way to escalate my privilege through a service that was there. But I will not report them that they have no flag. It's just more like a keeping track of it kind of thing. So it's interesting. Account with non-expired password in the domain admin group, at least 2. I mean, it's bad, but technically if the password is strong, there's really not much I can do about it. So that's the kind of stuff that you can report at the end when they don't have much in there. So this is where we were supposed to start with the 15-minute breaks before lunch, but I feel that we were already past the time. So I guess we can take 5 and resume at 1:50. And we're going to jump to the last module, which is the big one. So I guess at 1:50 we'll resume, so you can have a little walk and digest your lunch before we jump to that massive section. I think we have 550 slides, and there's 200 slides just for that section, so it's going to be a bit painful.
Not sure about that.
Est-ce que tu en bois aussi?
Ouais, mais je vais voir.
Non, c'est pas grave. Non, c'est correct, c'est des affaires Farfetch. De toute façon, tu t'en allais où?
Ben, j'aurais sûrement été en haut.
Ah, ben non, c'est correct. Et non, il sonne même pas. And we're back. Let me just take a sip of water. So, here we are, lateral movement. I strongly believe that red team engagement, the big part of it is actual lateral movement. And it's probably the most critical part when it comes to being detected, right? I'll try to... Oh, there's a typo here. I'm just keeping track of it. So it's really important because you're gonna have to do it at some point probably to get where you want to get, and you need to make sure that you understand the upsec behind what you're gonna do. And this is what we're gonna try to cover here and show you how it is important to actually adapt the tool set. So lateral movement is the ability to actually get to another system, but I'll say that personally it's more generic than that. It's about getting something that get you somewhere else. So capturing credentials is also including just make a bat with all the host name and blast it with psexec, boom, lateral. But technically it could work, and fun fact, there is context where it will make sense to use psexec. And I guess I don't necessarily have a slide on that, so I'll mention it here since you brought the psexec up. Surprisingly, there's big company that use psexec as their management tools. So they do have the psexec service installed and everything. So from a network perspective, to them it makes sense to actually have psexec in there running in their network through admin accounts, because that's how they manage their system. Which brings me back to my original point where listing process is interesting, but service is also interesting, because psexec by default you're not necessarily going to have a process running under it, but if you see that the psexec service is actually installed, well, you know that you can probably use psexec for lateral movement, and they're probably going to have a rule that whitelists everything related to psexec under their environment. So this is something to keep in mind, right? And this is where understanding your context and be fully aware of where you are may actually pay off. Like normally I'll tell you to never use psexec, but if they have it, well, have fun. Make sense? So back to the credentials. As I mentioned, lateral movement is compromising system or credentials. So it's always interesting to try to capture other set of credentials. There's multiple ways, and one of them that also people tend to overlook is actually ARP spoofing. It's still a thing, and I'll cover that in more details later on. But NetBIOS is also a fairly easy way to get NTLM-v2 hashes. You can always monitor for it, and you just wait for the credentials to appear. If you're lucky enough, you may get NTLM-v1 and kind of crack it with Rambo table. If you're not as lucky, you may actually get NTLM-v2, which is requiring a bit of work too. And just a side note regarding that, depending on the tool that you use, if you want to use the Rainbow table with NTLM-v1, you need to set the challenge to 1.1.2.2 up to 8. And use crack.sh with the Rainbow table. It's literally going to be free, and it's going to be a matter of seconds before you actually get the hash back. So that's something to keep in mind if you want to reduce the costs. So I guess you're probably all familiar with NetBIOS. I'm not going to go into too much details here, but long story short, everybody's authenticating each other to discover stuff. So you just pretend that you're you're presenting something, so you want the source to authenticate to yourself, and you're like, hey, please authenticate here. There's multiple ways to actually generate that traffic. There's a newer version of Responder that actually include DHCP and all that stuff that can be used to force a system to authenticate against a system that you fully control. But point is, you can capture hashes that way. You can also relay them. You don't necessarily have to crack them as long as they don't have SMB sign-in enable or sign-in enable. The whole ecosystem consists of several protocols. Technically, NetBIOS is just a mix of a bunch of stuff like NBNS, LLMNR, which are probably the one that you're going to see the most often because they're the newer version of it. Back then, they used to have the WINS as part of it, which is not really in use anymore. But yeah, point is they're going to authenticate against each other, and you can always relay that authentication if a SMB sign is not enabled. When relaying, the hash is not an option. The hash can be cracked offline, as I point out. It really depends on the strength of the password in this case for NTLM vhash, but if the password is fairly reasonable, you'll get it in less than a day. Once again, I remember where I used to work, like Mandiant, they have a really good cracking rig, and we could crack probably half of the one that we capture in less than a day, but they also had real good set in place and all that stuff, so it really helped. But once again, I was not the brain behind all of the permutation and cracking capability that we had, but it was pretty efficient. So you can capture hashes over the network using Responder. That's probably one of the most common one that you can use. I think the latest repo is not under Spiral Lab anymore because the guy actually quit Spiral Lab. a long time ago, and he actually uses his own repo now with the latest version. If you're running in a CobolStrike environment, you can always use the PowerShell C# equivalent, which is Invade and Invade 0, which is the C# version of it. Beauty of it is that you can run it from memory without ever touching this, which is always nice, right? As long as you get local admin privilege, you'll be able to capture on all the ports. Keep in mind that you can even run Invade with low privilege. You're not going to capture all of it, but you're still going to get some info out of it. So you may get HTTP traffic, which is still pretty valuable if you can get a hash out of it. Will NTLM relay work if only one of the machine, either client or server, has SMB sign-in enabled required? Usually it's on the target that it matters because you're actually taking the SMB request from one side. I think it's fully going to accept it if the target do not require. It's like the good old key exchange. It's like we're going to go with whatever the weakest is supported. So I think if one side is not supporting SMB sign-in, it should work, but don't quote me on that. It's been a long time since I didn't do any SMB relaying. I guess the best way to figure out is to actually give it a try. But I think if the target doesn't have it, you're good to go, because they're just gonna go with the least amount of security for the rest of the transaction. The cool thing about NetBIOS is that if it doesn't work with IPv4, you can always try IPv6. It may sound silly, but this is way too popular. Most systems actually have an IPv6 by default, and most companies don't know about it. They just, spin up their VM, and they forget the fact that the IPv6 stack by default in Microsoft is always going to be enabled. The point is, most of their firewall equipment, all that stuff, will only be applied to IPv4, so IPv6 is pretty much there unmanaged. That's why the middle 6 is quite efficient. You're just going to be able to capture all that stuff over IPv6 without any issue, because there's no limitation. So give it a try. You'll be really surprised of what you can capture over IPv6. And most of the time they're like, how the hell you do that? We don't have IPv6. I'm like, yes, you do. You just don't manage it. And it's always an interesting finding for the customer, because you realize that all this IPv6 access just enabled all over the place. Just out of curiosity, anyone in the chat have ever managed to capture stuff over IPv6 versus v4 because of the lack of configuration on IPv6? Personally, it happens like quite often. Yeah, so you kind of get your answer here. This is pretty common to see that kind of behavior. HTTPS internally, there's no need for that, right? The reason why I'm saying that is this is pretty common to see the intranet internally forcing you to be authenticated. Usually it's because they want to sync you with your account so they can provide you work-related stuff regarding you. The cool thing about that is that if you perform ARP spoofing between a workstation and a gateway, you'll be able to capture the HTTP negotiate, which is pretty much just capturing a hash over HTTP, right? Since they don't enforce HTTPS most of the time internally, you're going to be able to capture it without having to do anything fancy. I guess from a client perspective, my advice is always to make sure that you enable HTTPS, which also apply to whatever console you use internally. But ARP spoofing is quite efficient in that case. I can't remember if the new version of Windows have IP6 enabled by default. Good question. I feel like probably, because they're probably trying to push IPv6 down everybody's throat, because we're technically running out of IPv4, but that could be it, right? Help now resound protocol is true for sure. I know SLAAC is enabled on default in most Linux distro. I'm just not familiar with the term SLAAC. And there's arg4njo that allow you to analyze ARP requests. Yeah, ARP spoofing is actually super easy to detect. The reality is that clients that have a mildly modern network infrastructure will be able to detect it right away, but it's still worth giving it a shot. There's auto-configure IPv6, got it. But yeah, networking is also extremely powerful. I guess people are posting a bunch of interesting links regarding this kind of path, so feel free to take a look at these. But yeah, so point is, if there's no HTTPS, ARP spoofing is going to show you everything in clear. I guess that's the main takeaway here. In this case, you can get clear text password if you're looking at a application that does not use Windows authentication. If they're using Windows authentication, you're still gonna get the NTL negotiate packet, which is pretty much just a hash or sensitive information that can be useful to go further down the network. Typical gateway poisoning. The only downside I'd say here, if you're really wild, you could probably use Cain and Abel on a Windows workstation that you compromise and just trying to ARP spoof it there. The reality is, I don't think that there's many modern tool set that actually does it. That could be an interesting exercise to have, a buff file that actually do ARP poisoning and all that stuff for you. Because you can technically even capture traffic with NetSH, right? There's a built-in capability for it. But I'm pretty sure that someone somewhere have a buff file that actually perform ARP spoofing. But yes, you can do it on Windows, or you can do it on a system, especially if you do a red team where there's physical, and the physical access allowed you to connect the device or something like that. That's something that we used to do. It's like you connect something with a 3G USB stick on it, so you connect it to the network and you connect back to the device through the air, and you basically bridge inside of the network. The EVARP tools will incorporate some logic to try and identify stalled network addresses and then do targeted ARP spoofing to reduce the risk of screwing up the LAN. Ah, that makes sense. So it's kind of a smart ARP spoofing tools. But it's on Linux, right? So I guess having the equivalent that work natively on Windows will be nice. I guess we could probably do a Pi2X with KP or something like that to forge the ARP packet, because ARP packets are pretty much the simplest packet to make. It's like a source destination, MAC address tied to it, and that's about it. There's no fancy data in there. Ah, nice. So apparently this tool works on Windows too. I'll take a note of it, because it may be a much more modern alternative to achieve that in a cleaner way. Thanks for sharing information. But yeah, ARP spoof on Linux is actually works on Windows and written in Python. Got it. Makes sense. So they're probably using SCAPI under the hood, or SCAPI, whatever it's supposed to be called. Also BetterCap. Yeah, that's true. BetterCap is another one. But yeah, there's plenty of options, that's for sure. So yeah, ARP spoof on Linux, pretty straightforward. You just spoof whatever you want to spoof, and you listen for the traffic, and then you analyze it. There's even tools like pcres that may actually allow you to get the data out of it. I've noticed that sometimes it's going to pick stuff that it's not going to pick everything, so manual processing of the pcap may also provide some more data, but it's usually helping you a bit with the processing. Okay, cool. So you managed to gain access to a domain user. What's next? You can remotely query a DC on dumb computers, users, and SPN. That's something to keep in mind. Once again, one of the good way to bypass EDR is to actually SOX proxy all your tooling. The point here is that instead of running it on the system, you're just going to use the system to tunnel whatever you want to do. I'm assuming that most of you probably have Linux systems, so if you want to actually remotely query all of this, you can do it through your SOX proxy. And Linux support net command and packet have a bunch of interesting scripts that allow you to do that. But if you want to do it natively on Linux, you can actually just use the netrpc group member, where you specify a remote target, and you can actually search for all the users, and it support all kind of RPC command natively. So you just spin that through a SOX proxy, and you'll be able to get all the information without ever running anything on the computer that you compromise. All you have here is a SOX proxy, so it's always a little nice trick to know. LDAP search is another really interesting one on Linux. At the end of the day, it just relies on LDAP most of the time. And Packet also offer get AD user utility. LDAP utility on Windows also provides some some C# script that pretty much achieve the same. Once again, using the same technique. Quick question for you. I want you to actually take a look at getAdUser.py, which is part of the mpacket example, and tell me how it actually. Oh, it's scrolling the wrong way around. And telling me how it actually fetched information. Keep in mind that this can be run on Linux. If you're not familiar with the solution, let me find you a link to mpacket. So I want you to tell me how they actually gather the AD user information, which protocol, how they actually do it. Just pasted the link here if you don't know where you can find it. So whoever finds the answer first get a hard point. Yep, someone got the answer. And this is super unrelated, but apparently Microsoft decided to roll back the decision of blocking Office macro by default. This is actually super interesting. Let me share the link. So I guess you don't really have to worry about that anymore. They're all going to be enabled by default. That's an interesting decision, let's say, from a security standpoint. And good news for us. Pretty much, yeah, that's interesting. I'm really surprised that they actually decided to do that. Anyway, back to the tools. As someone pointed out, you may have recognized the LDAP query in here. So all it does is pretty much connect to LDAP as the comment highly suggests in the tools, and you're gonna have some queries. So depending on the filter, you may notice that they may provide you with more information. And keep in mind here in this case that if you ask for do not list all the disabled account, it's just adding a bit of more complex query to make sure they get rid of it. But point is, it's just LDAP. Keep in mind that LDAP can be queried with a bunch of different tools. So this is just an example here. That LDAP is actually quite portable, if I can put it that way. You can use it with pretty much everything to get everything. And the other cool thing about Microsoft, and I'm going to go into too much detail, but you can authenticate against Microsoft using so many techniques. It's just stupid. I think they even lost track of the amount of different ways to authenticate that this supports. So you can pass the hash, pass the ticket, clear text password. There's probably going to have a blockchain authentication soon for Microsoft, I feel. If it was not clear enough, LDAP is quite interesting. And fun fact about LDAP that you may not know, LDAP is listening on which port. This is a quiz. Whoever get it right in the chat first, get a hard point. Which port is used by LDAP? And LDAP-S, here we go. You already had the answer ready. Out of curiosity, I'm assuming that you didn't spoil yourself. Which one is the process that actually take care of all the LDAP? It's not LDAP.com. Fun fact, .com file actually are executable file in Microsoft. I wanted to actually start coding old .com application, so you can actually, it's just compiled slightly differently, but you can have .com application, it's going to be executed. So I figured that people will trust everything that is .com because they're so used to see this with the internet. So back to LDAP. The process under the hood that actually is taking care of LDAP is LSASS. If it's new to you, well, that's interesting. The reason why it's interesting is if you found a vulnerability in LDAP that allow you to get code execution or whatever, you basically have code execution inside of LSASS. That's quite interesting. Not sure why they didn't have like a middleware process between LSASS and LDAP, but apparently this is how they decided to do it. So if you were not familiar with that, just assume that if you find a massive ODE regarding LDAP, you probably have a code execution vector inside of LSASS. So that's just a little note here. And Kerberos authentication too is done over LSASS. I'm pretty sure there's a bunch of stuff to be uncovered. So if you're into fuzzing, Kerberos, which is port 88, and LDAP are probably a good target. Speaking of our friend LSASS, there is not much EDR that monitor LDAP yet, which is quite surprising. This is again more slide for the blue team than the red team, but I know that there's a lot of actual EDR that inject themselves into LSASS to monitor it, so they technically already have the visibility to put their hook in place and see which kind of LDAP query the OS receive and take action on it. I'm just not sure why they didn't do it yet, but the thing is they have everything in place, and I wish that eventually we're going to see that. And an example, by the way, of one that come to mind is Cisco AMP. If you have a malicious process running, they're never going to inject themselves inside of your process. What they do instead is that they inject their data inside of what they consider to be protected process, like LSASS and other processes like that. And what they do is they actually monitor the activity from there. So as long as you don't try to dump LSASS and stuff like that with Cisco AMP, you're going to be good. But the second that you're trying to touch it, this is where they're going to actually alert. So that's an interesting way of doing things. I'm not sure this is the most optimal one, but it's the way that they decided to do it. Yes, Endol cats probably work because of the duplicate Endol, because you're not technically touching LSASS per se. So yeah, that's the beauty of it. As I pointed out several times already, LDAP Active Directory contain bunch of attributes that are fairly interesting. Do not hesitate to actually list them. You may always be surprised and discover that they have some tools that can be used to do all kind of magic in there. So that's fairly interesting to take a look at LDAP. And if you're not familiar with LDAP, you should definitely spend some time in there. You'll be amazed of the amount of data that you can find. Same goes with RPC. This is an example of, all the stuff that you can get, right? And these are the ones that are actually done by default. Keep in mind that there's potentially more than that, but this is just a good example of what you can get. So in this case, I kind of blurred out some of the information, but you can get street address, department, telephone, and all that stuff, so you can actually leverage that against the users if you're trying to do phishing or anything like that. Speaking of LDAP, another cool one is ADCS. I'm assuming that if you guys are doing red teaming on a regular basis, you probably heard of it. If not, I guess it's time to actually spend some time on it, because there's so many stuff that can be done with this. Long story short, ADCS is mostly poorly implemented and misunderstood by most of the sysadmin that actually have to deal with it. All it does is it's actually the Active Directory certificate authority. So you can authenticate on the network and Active Directory with certificate, and you can request them, and you need to have privileges and all that stuff to be able to do so. If you didn't read the paper, I highly recommend that you go through it. The reality is, I think they documented 8 privilege escalation. You'll mostly find 2 or 3 of them to be there, and the one that I found to be the most common is the one where you have the enrollee supply subject. Long story short, you can request a certificate on your behalf. That's normal, right? You just ask a certificate for you. You can think of VPN authentication where they use user certificate, for example. So instead of providing a password, the VPN is looking at a certificate. It's like, oh yeah, trust this one. Here's your access to the VPN. That's the kind of reason why you had certificate enabled in your network. The beauty of enrollee supply subject, it means that if you actually have a certificate, you're allowed to have an alternate name inside of the certificate. So you can be like, hey, I would like to have a certificate for Charles and admin. The reason why it's a vulnerability, actually it's a misconfiguration more than anything else, is that all users are allowed to add another one, is that you can actually put a privilege account in there, then you can later on request a certificate only for the alternate users that you provided in there. So you technically end up with a certificate for a domain admin user that is probably privileged on the network, right? And a regular user can request a certificate with multiple names. That's the misconfiguration that you'll probably see more often. If you never try it, Certify is actually really great. It's going to provide you with all the information that you need to figure out which certificate allow you to do what, and you may find some vulnerability in there. There's also a Certify version of it, which is nice because you can always SOX proxy it if you don't want to run Certify on the system. Keep in mind that it's .NET, so you can always use it, run it using execute assembly. There's also a buff version of it. I think it's just called, it's part of the situation awareness, where it's just going to dump you all the information. The cool thing about Certify is it's going to tell you like which one are vulnerable and all that stuff, so it's even more complete. But if you're willing to do the parsing and have a good understanding of all of this, well, you can do it directly. And the link between AD and Active Directory Certificate Authority and LDAP is that you actually get most of the information inside of LDAP. And this is an example of where LDAP admin is quite useful, right? You have your LDAP instance, in this case, ring 0 local, and you have all of these, OU, CN, and all that stuff, and you realize that most of the information that you're looking for is hidden inside of configuration, and you can get to the services and public key services, and you actually get to your certificate authority name and all that stuff. And notice here that you have certificate templates, so all the templates are actually technically defined here. You have a lot of information that is actually presented in LDAP. So you can always try to just query LDAP, see if there's any ADCS involved. If you find one, at least you can try to run more complete tools to see which one are vulnerable to what. But if there's nothing of such, there's no point of running the tools because there's no output that's going to be generated anyway. And if you look at those attributes here, for example, you'll notice here that you have the certificate authority, you have the information related to it. So this is the kind of stuff that you probably want to play with and get familiar with it, and especially with the distinguished name. Remember I told you earlier, if you want to query some specific attributes, I'd rather use the full path, because if you just ask for C and ring 0 C, they'll be like, what the hell are you looking for? That's why providing the full path is actually going to help you perform your LDAP query, because you're probably so used to see, trying to find one, like object class users, but you usually need much more than that. So connecting to, instead of just being ring 0, I'll specify like, the full path here, which is not just ring 0. It's going to be something like DC ring 0. It's actually starting from the end, so it's going to be local ring 0, CN configuration, CN service, CN AIA, and you're going down that path. That's why sometimes if you're just trying to query like public service, public key service, or services, you're not going to get anything because it doesn't know where to find it. So hopefully that clarify a bit how the whole structure works. That's why I love to show the distinguished name. Speaking of LDAP and ADCS, what about RPC, or a mix of all of these together? Looking at you, Pitspatam. Pitspatam was originally leveraging RPC to actually get the server or DC computer account being leaked that you can actually relay. Most of the attacks that were originally published rely on the fact that you relay it to the ADCS, so you ask a certificate on behalf of that computer for a domain admin or something like that, and you can actually compromise it. Under the hood, Pitspatam was abusing of an RPC service called EFS, which was like a file encryption service remotely, so you could actually, the reason why it was connecting to a service, it was because it was actually just trying to authenticate on the machine that it has to perform the encryption, right? The cool thing about this is if you have NTLM v1 downgrade, you don't even need to have the ADCS, because it is a reality. There is companies that don't have certificate authority in place. So if you don't have that specific part of it, you can also relay it on LDAP. That was something that was also published not too long ago, but it's been like that since day one, in the sense that you can always write information to LDAP. You can do it with Python too, so you get the information, you relay it to RPC and to LDAP, and you can actually modify some attribute. At least you can modify your own attribute, right? So keep in mind that if you're relaying the hash of a domain computer, well, you're kind of granted local admin on your own LDAP computer, so you can modify the domain controller computer attribute in LDAP since you're kind of yourself, so you have full read-write access to it. Someone is actually part of the Patreon release another kind of vector that is called, it's relying on DFS core, the course, I don't know how to pronounce that, sorry about that. It's pretty much leveraged the same concept, and the fun fact is I'm a huge fan of RPC because literally everything is in there, and I just wanted to show you a quick way of actually getting there. There's a document in the training portal that you can download. I think it's called protocol, and there's also a zip file that contains all the PDF, and the point is all those RPC are documented by Microsoft, and I gathered a list of it in a document where you have the link, and pretty much all I did is automatically download all the spec for all of these. And the trick is that you can actually fairly easily identify other RPC vector that may present the same kind of pattern, right? Here's an example of what I did. I gathered a list of them. You can search through it for yourself, and spoiler, there is technically ODAs in there. There's at least 3 more. DF coauthor was actually known by me, but it's kind of burned now because it's public, but there's at least 3 more that I know of, and I'll show you how you can find them. You can search for all functions that remotely do something. It's fairly simple. Here's an example. The functionality that it's actually used by the latest version is netar DFS add root. If you search through all the PDF that you have in the zip and you just search for like remote or stuff like that, you'll realize that all the documentation is literally there. It's like this functionality is clearly documented, all the parameters, so pretty much all you have here. Server name, the pointer to an automated Unicode string. This is the host name of the new DFS root target. So usually if you look for specific keyword, remember like pretty much what we did with the Google Docs to look for callback function. If you look for a specific keyword like, you know, root target, remote server, server name, and all that stuff, you're going to realize that you have plenty of those available. And I guess I can probably show it to you real quick. Where's the link? I'll just take the link. It may be hard to actually code RPC, but the reality is what you probably did here is probably rely on bitspatam, and all you have to do is create a class that match whatever the definition is of what you want to do. So you have the response and the request kind of thing, which is the response of the RPC, which is technically not something that you really care that much unless you have multiple call, and you just declare whatever the function which is matching the Microsoft documentation, like this one here, for example, was just re-implemented. And all you have to do afterward is just send a request. So you initialize a RPC authentication. So it's just a wrapper on top of it that allows you to do the authentication. And then you bind to whatever ID associated with this one, which is once again something that you'll find in the documentation. And finally, all you have to do is send a request to the vulnerable object with whatever proper parameters. In this case, root server and server name is going to be the one that you have access to it. So long story short, there is really plenty of other RPC call that can be found to leak hashes. There's plenty of them that are actually not present by default. That's the sad part of it. But yeah, this is actually really simple to do if you kind of know where to look for. And I kind of provided you with a list of all the protocols and stuff that you can use to search through it. But keep in mind that all of this is no secret. It's just documented. You just have to spend the time to go through all of the documentation. There's even more than that. There's more than just, you know, leaking hash. There's slurry functionality probably here that are totally broken. You just need to spend time on it to try to identify how they work. But at least knowing that you have the documentation and all the calls are properly documented is probably going to save you a lot of time. Just out of curiosity, anyone in here have actually spent time looking at the RPC documentation? I'll take this as a no, but I highly recommend it. Someone is asking if I usually use those undocumented RPC relaying attack during engagement. It really depends, I'll be honest with you. if the client is not really mature, I'll go with whatever is public, because the reality is 99% of the time I'll end up having something out of one of those vectors. If the client is extremely mature and they have all kind of detection in place, so network detection, all that stuff, I'll go with less documented stuff. And the reason why is you still have authentication for most of the time, because every time you actually call one of those RPC, you may be authenticated. Petit Patin at the beginning was not true, because one of the patches that they force authentication on top of it, but originally you can do it unauthenticated. But most of the other vector that I found myself are all authenticated, so at least you have an authentication event in there. And these are not necessarily vulnerability. I guess they're more feature than anything, so it's not like they have to report or anything. But yeah, I used two against two different customers. I guess the same against two different customers, and because they had really good network detection, but they were not capable of actually identifying the fact that this specific authentication was malicious. And that was the point. It's like, how can we actually try to see this is malicious? And this is where sysmon entered the equation and all that stuff. So I kind of provided them some ideas of how you can actually correlate login event and activity on the target system, because once again, every time you do an RPC call, something will happen on the system eventually, right? The RPC is really the allowing you to just connect to a remote system and execute code in there. So that was the kind of recommendation I provided to them. But the reality is, most of the time you're not going to have to get to that level of details. The reason why I did it was purely for my own pleasure, and like realizing that document is the Microsoft documentation is literally providing you with all the evidence that you need to be able to do so. Hopefully that answered your question. And there's plenty of other stuff there. You could actually just build an RPC fuzzer out of all of these variables, and you'll end up probably finding some literally exploit in there, like buffer overflows and stuff. Especially when you see Unicode and there's conversion, there may be some bad conversion between NC and Unicode and all that stuff. You never know. So have fun searching through all the Microsoft PDF. I have 400 of them ish inside of the rpc.zip in the training portal. So if you want to take a look at this, as I tell you, there's at least 3 others. Way to get a callback in there, pretty much like Petit Patin or the DFS. So have fun. Feel free to. I can probably share 1 or 2 if you're interested. But it's not that they're super secret. It's just that I found that the thought process behind it is more interesting than the actual result. That's why I'd rather have you search for it. This is really not that hard. It's just a matter of reading the documentation. Reading Microsoft documentation is the key. And another perfect example of that, after ADCS Certify was actually published, keep in mind that these were not about any actual CVE, right? Someone actually did manage to find a CV out of this, because you may have never heard of it before, but sometimes you just need that little push to kind of start your research. And CVE 2022-26-923 is actually abusing of a bug in the way that the certificate requests work. So this person was probably curious, started to play with it, and realized that they actually find something. Long story short, user have the UNP concept and computer have SPN. You can create your own computer account and request a certificate for it. That's nothing special. We know about that. So you could actually create a computer called Charles that have no value and ask for a certificate for it, and you'll be happy, right? The SPN value is used to validate the host name. So it's going to assign an SPN value to it. Remove it, and you can ask for whatever you want. That was pretty much the vulnerability in there. So the idea is that you create an account. By default, you are allowed to create 10 of them. That's just one of the misconfigurations I see quite often. Technically, a more mature company will actually disable this, because it's leading to that kind of stuff. So keep in mind that the machine template for the computer support a subject alternative required DNS, which is pretty much the same as having an alternative supplier for the name when you're trying to exploit the user with a second name in there. The way that it works, however, is that it's going to update the DNS host name to a DC name. So what you do is, let's say you create a Charles computer account, and you change the DNS host name to one of the domain controller in the environment. So I don't know, let's say DC1. And then if you're trying to request a certificate for that, it's going to fail. It's going to tell you that the DNS name is not matching, which totally makes sense because you're trying to impersonate someone else in the environment. And Microsoft did their thing properly. However, the person discovered that the DNS hostname is not actually the value that is used to perform the validation. It's, however, the service principal name, aka the SPN for this account. So if you're capable of actually modifying the service principal name to something that it's matching, you're going to be good to go. So the first attempt was to change the service principal name to DC1 and request a certificate. This fell once again because of the validation. And the person decided to give it another try and just remove the SPN attribute of the object. Keep in mind that you're allowed to do it because you fully control the object. So in this case, SPN was removed because the SPN is actually the value that is used to validate the subject alternative required DNS and check if the object already exists. It's going to succeed. So, however, the certificate will also have a alternative host name in there, which is the one matching whatever you put in the DNS host name, which is a DC. So you end up with a certificate for Charles and the DC, and it's validly signed because the validation on the certificate authority was performed against the SPN, and it was just null, so it didn't do anything, and it would just accept your certificate. So that was literally the vulnerability in the fact that if no SPN was present, it should fail, and they addressed that. But here's the key, right? Someone just spent time on it, play with it, and ended up with that behavior and found a CV out of it. So the same goes with RPC. You may have never played with it, but you kind of have some documentation in here, have fun, and you're probably going to find a bunch of valuable stuff in there. Main takeaway here is be curious. Literally simple as that. Make sense? And just out of curiosity, were you guys aware of that specific vulnerability that was released not too long ago? It's a pretty powerful one. It's basically regular user to domain admin without doing anything. All you have to do is being allowed to create 10 computers account. Well, technically you only need one, but yeah, that's it. And it's extremely trivial. All you have to do is one LDAP query to create it, one LDAP to remove the SPN, request a certificate on this computer behalf, and you're good to go. Yeah, that's the thing with COVID. People had a lot of free time, so there's so much stuff going on. But yeah, definitely. But the point here is not necessarily even the vulnerability. It's just the fact that I'm suspecting that this person probably started to dig around when they read the ADCS documentation. They're like, hey, there's much more that can be done to it, and actually identify a legitimate vulnerability, which is nice. But it's super simple. Honestly, you're 2 LDAP query away from being able to get DA with that. And imagine you're working in the security industry and you miss it. So imagine the amount of sysadmin that may have missed to apply the patch. Just saying. Once you attract a list as user, you can perform password spraying to gather more account. You may find this silly, but this is probably the technique that I use the most often to actually perform password spraying. I really love to just use SMB client. The reason why is it's a full authentication. It's just legitimate. And I just do a loop and put this loop inside of proxy chain. There's other fancy way of doing it, but I just found it's actually super nice and easy to do it, especially with proxy chain. But you can definitely, it's just a little spoiler trick. Once again, here SMB client is built in Linux. But there's a bunch of other tools. For example, you can actually use the 80 password brute force. The reason why I like this one personally is because I'm relying on a functionality that is built in there. It's actually using something called validate credential. So the purpose of this API is literally to validate credential. That's all it does. So you provide credentials, it's going to tell you if they're valid or not as a boolean. So that's why I found this one super convenient. No need to have all the fancy stuff. It's a super compact script, but I just really like it. So you can feed a list of users and it's going to tell you if it's valid or not. You can also do it with the LDAP utility using the password brute force switch. If you're curious about this one, I'll show you real quick. AD Untool. It's now part of AD Untool. As you can see here, it does a LDAP query, and then it does the principal context, and it does validate credentials. Sounds familiar? It is, because technically all we did here in this is using some of those functionality that are built in C#. So that's the beauty of how PowerShell works. You can always invoke C# by using the full path like that. That's just the syntax. So you have the domain and the new object system directory service, blah, 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 which is pretty much the same as here. It's just that the only difference is principal context is declared as part of the using directory, active directory system, which is matching this. So that's why, you know, different language, same result. So it's not like the PowerShell version is not going to call any of those Windows API. It's just using a different language. And that's also something important to keep in mind when you're like, oh, this tool doesn't work. Let me try the Go version of it or the NIM version of it. At the end of the day, you're going to call the exact same API. GPP, as I mentioned, fun fact, even if these are not used anymore, Microsoft, I think in 2014 or something like that, decided to address that by removing the feature. Fun fact though, they may still be there in the main controllers, so old system that never changed their password may still work. Latest engagement, I found one, and it was still working on a couple of old servers, so you never know. 8 years later kind of thing, and there's tools to automate the whole process too. But never underestimate how legacy your target is. Kube roasting attack, take advantage of how service account work. Oh yeah, it's crazy how GPP are often there. And there's more than just group policy. There's also a feature that allows you to push scheduled tasks on remote system through GPOs. And you can also authenticate as someone else, and they use pretty much the same encryption scheme to hide the password. But this one I think is still active. It was not disabled, but I don't see that one often, but it's another vector for that kind of password gathering. Kube roasting attack, I think we kind of covered that in details earlier, so I'm not going to spend too much time here, but point is it's super popular. That's why I kind of put like plenty of tools as an example, but there's plenty of tools that allow you to actually do it. You can even do it remotely through a proxy if you are in Linux with Empacia. Empire have it. There's 20 version of it. I'd say that the most popular is probably Rubius right now. So $1 million question, how the hell does it works, right? Under the hood, well, it's LDAP query to find a list of accounts that actually have SPN enabled. So first things first, your query need to make sure that the account is not disabled, because there's no point of requesting the hash on an account that is not enabled anymore. Then you're gonna make sure that there's a service principal name set, because that's how it works, right? SPN is a service principal name. So this is where, so if this is something I want to know, and if the account is actually enabled, and if it's a normal account, then I want to make sure that it's also part of the computer. So if you get all of this, this is how you're going to end up with queries like that. So you'll be able to actually get a list of them. Once again, you could bypass most of the feature by searching for a dot and remove the disable account and all that stuff to make the query slightly different than what they're used to for most of the tools, and you're not going to raise any alert. So principal accounts start with A star, B star, and remove the disable check. You can always do the disable check manually afterward. A regular user can request a ticket for any server principal and can attempt a brute force offline, so that's the beauty of it. The ticket are encrypting using the account password as the key. If you're curious to know which one is the default one, you can always check the MSDS support encryption type attribute in Active Directory. If it was not clear enough, there's tons of information in Active Directory LDAP. So if you're curious to see, the default settings are RC4, AS128, and AS256, aka 1C or 28 in decimal, so you can always query that information and see what you'll get. And as you can see here, most environment will actually tell you that it's this specific case. So this is all the type that they support, and most of the time you'll see that tooling requests RC4. The main reason why they do it is because it's much faster to crack. versus AES, but technically another way to actually bypass most of the detection is to request a AS256 instead of the RC4. So it's just the way that you actually prepare your request for the curb roasting that may actually make a huge difference on which kind of encryption you want. Once again, it may evade some of the detection in place. Make sense? Wonderful. While you're querying against the computer object and not the user, since SPF tied to the user account, it may have been a typo, to be honest. Yeah, object category. It's not. It's a negation. I want to make sure that it's not a computer account, not that it's an actual computer account. That's why. It's just because this is where it's actually defined. The MSDS supported encryption type is actually defined in the object class computer. I think it's defined for as a global thing inside of it. So if you use LDAP admin, you'll notice that in this specific attribute here, you have computer, and you have a bunch of attributes that are assigned to an actual computer object. So there's all kind of predefined settings in there. I guess I can probably try to spin a lot and show it to you real quick. Hopefully it's gonna boot. Last time I had a hard time with my hard drive to connect, so I was not even able to launch it, but we'll see. Yeah, you can always see this as a filter, right? So it's like, hey, I want to query this specific attribute inside of that specific location. I don't know what you're talking about. There's no EDR in that screen. No, no, no. I think it was actually in the workstation here. For you, it's already there. Are we actually connected? So that's LDAP admin. As you can see here, you have like the OU domain controller, you have the CNRZ. You can always edit entry. I'm not sure that I'm actually I'm connected. And when you do edit entry, you'll see all the attributes that are actually in there. Sometimes they're not going to be relevant, but as you can see, in this location, you have all of these attributes. So you'll notice here that you have the LDAP password. I think right now I'm currently logged in as a I know this one was purposely misconfigured, so you see SPN, you have all kind of information. Notice that there's more than one, by the way. You can have multiple times the same SPN. That could be another interesting vulnerability, right? If you have multiple of one, that it's actually validate only the first one when it comes to what we saw. So that could actually be something that you could try. I never tried, but as you can see here, there's plenty of different SPN names for one system. So maybe the certificate only validate the first one, the last one, or whatever. So if you put 20 in there, is it gonna work? Best way to actually figure out is to give it a try. But as you can see inside of that specific location, there's plenty of objects that are not necessarily associated with anything. And if you go into computers and you edit entries, you'll notice that once again you have plenty of other stuff here. So if we scroll to the attribute that I forget the name of, it's MSDS support encryption type. MSDS. I guess I can kind of search. Can I put like this? No. Okay, that was useless. nice. MSDS. But eventually you should see it somewhere. I'm just really bad at it. That may actually be part of a computer one, because when you actually request all the computers, it doesn't really, it just match all of them, so whatever the first one it found. MS, I just already forget the name. Terrible memory. MS supported. Yeah, so you see in this case it's here, it's just not set in the specific case. Maybe it's on the computer account. I generally don't remember, but one of them will support encryption type. And let's just put arbitrary data and break the whole thing. Here we go. But it should normally show here. Oh, it's in the built-in, but it should not. It's in computers as far as I know. Oh no, I'm done. It's because I know why. Just give me a sec. It's because of the query here. Notice that I'm actually looking at CN instead of object categories. Object categories is computers, and here is the actual CN computers. That's just me being stupid as usual. Object categories and CN are two different things. And I'm actually not sure if you can actually query object categories. I think there's a way to actually come up with your own LDAP query. Just have to wait for the tools to crash. Yeah, let's just delete random rows, right? Query. I just need to figure it out. It's been a while since I didn't use it. Bookmark, edit entry. I don't want to edit this specific entry. I guess if I just do it like that, can I supply whatever I want to filter on? Yes, it should normally do it that way. Or maybe it's actually here if I just specify the global, but I doubt. MS. No, it's not there. I really have to actually add the filter. I saw something here about object class. New. Here we go. Computers. That went well. I think we have a crash, guys. Okay, I think it's time to say goodnight to LDAP admin for now. I'm just gonna hard shut it down and try it again. And yeah, I won't. actually inside of it? I guess we'll find out soon. Supported. I'm just not sure where I am right now, so let me just double check. If I click on this, can I get the information? Finance schema, maybe? It's gonna tell me that it's inside of computers, or it's actually searching inside of the domain for now. No, it's just tell you. Okay. So how can I tell that I want to be in the object computers? That's interesting. Object class, yes, I'm fully aware that is what I'm looking for. May, blah, blah, blah. Can you actually just click on it? I guess sometimes using a UI is not as efficient as actually doing it manually, right? And I think I have, does it support query? I don't even remember. But yeah, but you get the point that sometimes, you know, the UI is efficient, but sometimes it's not. I'm just curious to see that. Can I just support query? I think I just remove it from this one, so I can do, I have another one. Let me just check something real quick. LDAP query. Domain, so ring 0. If you actually do it manually, so object class equals computer. Oops. And you specify like name. Where's my computer? Oh, it's like object categories. I always make that. No, object class computers. Oh yeah, I need to build Kotlin. Most likely. Here we go. So as you can see here, we're in the object class computers, and we are extracting names. So you get pretty much all the computer information, which we can validate. I guess there's no point of validating it with LDAP, but instead here what I'm asking is the attribute for the MSDS supported encryption types. Supported encryption types. And as you can see here, we get the value for each of the computer, and that's why some of these were actually empty. You may notice that it's actually returning it for all computers, because what we did here is like, hey, can you provide information for all the computers in the object class? So I guess when I'm trying to show it to you earlier, I was just unlucky. I guess RZDC should actually contain the information. We can take a quick look at it. Yeah, but that's the thing, they're not going to be here because I don't know how to get those sorted that way. Or maybe if I do it that way, yeah, that is probably going to work. Assuming that's showing me the computer attribute. And here we go. So in this case, it was actually storing it properly. It's just that in this case, RZDC, which is the first one, is not inside of the computer. That's why you just want to filter out on the class object class computer. If you do the same query with user, obviously you should not get anything unless there is a field like that set for users. And apparently there is some users. So these may actually be interesting user just for the sake of it. So desktop, yeah, so these are related to computers, which kind of makes sense, right? So these two also have an encryption because they're probably computer account. Same goes here, that's why, but these don't have the attribute for obvious reason because they're not expecting to have any of these enabled. Hopefully that answered your question. Sorry for the sloppy part where I was searching for all my stuff. Okay, so that's pretty much it. Point is, you can always get the encryption type, and you may have noticed that this is actually set per item, so you may come across cases where a specific computer may not have the type supported 28. Feel free to just check whatever it stands for, but most of the time, by default, it's going to be 28. So, Impacket is pretty wonderful, right? We've done a lot with it. You probably have used it in the past. Just out of curiosity in the chat, how many of you have actually used Impacket, I guess, instead of having a bunch of yes? I'll just use Impacket, and if you... Impacket. So thumbs up if you use it, thumbs down if you never. Just out of curiosity to see how many people... So fire is a good thing or a bad thing? Yes, and we'll go down that path. So cool thing is we know at least that half of you have used Impacket in the past. The other half just probably don't care about answering the question, or you fall asleep a long time ago. But I'm pretty confident that most of you probably have played with Impacket. What I'm curious, and this is an honest question here, have you ever look at how it works? Thumbs up and thumbs down. Thumb down is yes you did. Bacon means I don't know. What the hell bacon is supposed to mean? Of course everybody's gonna fucking use bacon. So I guess most of you have take a look at it. I don't know how which kind of level of details you went down, but this section here is just to kind of show you that most of the tool set may have a bunch of interesting pitfall. And as someone pointed out, WMI exec can actually be easily picked by EDR. The reason is not because of the WMI technique itself, it's because of what the tool does. And this is what we're going to cover. First of all, there's something really interesting. We're going to start with NTLM SSP negotiate. Long story short, you're authenticating on the remote system. Notice something interesting here, and that's going to become really interesting later on, because I want to make a strong distinction between SMB and RPC. SMB is SMB and RPC is RPC. You'll understand why I'm mentioning that. Our SMB is using which port? Anyone in the chat? Yes. And RPC? Perfect. WinRM? No, that's RDP. WinRM. Yep. 5985. Perfect. So I guess you guys know your tools. That's good. The reason why I'm saying that is I've seen a lot of people recommending that companies should actually block SMB between hosts. Yes, 5986 is the WinRM over HTTPS. We'll talk about that a bit later, but yes, it's also a valid answer. So a lot of people recommend that they actually block SMB. The truth is it doesn't matter, especially for lateral movement. You don't actually care about none of that. All you really care under the hood is RPC, and that's one of the reasons why I don't like some of the way that Impacket Suite was actually designed. Back to what we saw here, we have SMB2 negotiated, so we're just authenticating over SMB. Nothing fancy here. Then eventually we're going to switch to DC RPC, which makes sense. We're going to bind to something, and notice here that you have a second authentication, net NTLM SSP over RPC. Authentication, and then when you're successfully authenticated, this is where you're going to start remote creating instance. That's actually really interesting. This is where you actually get the RPC up and running. So it's going to query the good old root CIMv2, which is pretty much like the database that contains all the WMI information, and you're going to get ready to do your magic here. In this, you're also going to have a request where you're going to actually query the Win32 process, because you're allowed to create one remotely using WMI and also locally. And this is pretty much what the packet looks like. So you have the Win32 process create. Doesn't matter what the structure is. It's just, you know, RPC stuff. Main takeaway here is, in this case, the command that I ran was pause, but notice that there's also a cmd/q/c pause, pipe to 127 admin $_ with what appears to be Unix timestamp or something like that. This is most of the part that get detected by EDR easily because of that specific pattern here. You know, they can fingerprint that fairly easily. And the $1 million question is, why the hell did they did that? Well, remote WMI has no way for you to provide you visual outcome of what you ran. So the solution to make it usable for most of us was to actually save the output to a file and actually grab it later on. Keep in mind that all of the execution was done over RPC, right? But you have this file created here that obviously contained the output of whatever was run. In this case was pause. And this is where, after the RPC, you're going to see some SMB v3 traffic. This is where it actually fetched the output and it's going to present it to you, which is not something that you really need. I strongly believe that lateral movement should only be about getting access to another system. That's why you'll see that I'm going to present some of my techniques and none of them actually have output. I believe that you don't need that output. So you can probably get rid of all that SMB traffic just by getting rid of the visual output for WMI exec. And the beauty of this is you may realize that even if you tell your client to block 445, if they have 135 enabled, it doesn't change anything because you can do all of this over RPC. All you do is RPC connect, WMI create, and wait for your shell to call back without ever getting visual output. So is this new information to you? Thumbs up, yes. Thumbs down if no. Just curious. Okay, so there's a lot of people that actually took a look at it but didn't went down that path. So it's nice to see that there's a lot of people that spend time on it but never realize that kind of stuff. I'm not saying that all of you never figure it out, but yeah, that's the point of like looking at all the tools work, and all it took was really just Wireshark to have a better understanding of it, right? Point is, lateral movement SMB is bad. I haven't used that tool in a long time. I had a C# implementation of domain routes for quite some times. Just out of curiosity, do you capture the output or you just run the command and hope for the best? I can't remember how I got it back. Yeah, I'm a huge fan of spray and pray when you do your lateral movement, because technically you probably know what you're doing, so you don't really care about the outcome. But yeah, if you were doing the remote WMI, you probably had to save the data somewhere because, or use a name pipe or whatever, but you have to establish communication, and name pipe also required 445 for communication, so it pretty much ended up being the same result from a network perspective. But we'll get back to that case later. And obviously from a process creation perspective, it's fairly easy. You're going to have the WMI service process just spawning whatever you asked to be spawned, and you can confirm that your command is in here. So this is another fairly easy indicator. Whatever child process of WMI is highly suspicious. So if you look at it from a detection perspective, we have SMB authentication, we have CMD that was spawned by WMI, we have file written to this, and we have all the file transferred over SMB. The reality is, if you remove the output, you can get rid of most of these artifacts here and only have the DC RPC part of it. Another cool one that you probably have never heard of before is something that I released, and I was pretty quiet about it just because I don't care and nobody care. I just found this one to be quite interesting. It's called Poison Handler. You may be familiar with protocol handler in Microsoft. Long story short, you can actually define a protocol handler, and by default, it's going to be able to just handle it and do something based on what it is. The idea here is I just wanted to hide the actual command that I'm going to run later on. The idea is quite simple. Notice here that all you have is DC RPC, so I'd rather have no SMB, which means that I'm not going to have any output, but that's fine by me. The idea here is that we're actually going to register a protocol handler remotely. If you look at the packet, you'll notice that all I do is actually create a registry key. using the underlying standard reg provider create key. At the bottom here, you have the description of the key. The MS browser is random. I think, if I remember correctly, the tool was creating that one by default, but you can always specify yours. And the registry key is always going to be in software classes. You create whatever name you want, and you're also going to have another set of registry key under that is going to be shell open command, and this is where you're going to put your command. In this case, it was just calc.exe, which means that every time the operating system will see the MS browser handler, it's going to execute whatever's in shell open command. The idea here is that you create that registry key, which is not that bad. I mean, most CDR now, they will not complain about the fact that you registered a real protocol handler like that. This is like typical stuff, so they'll be like, okay, that just doesn't do anything. Where the beauty of this shine is after that, when you're actually gonna try to execute it, instead of having to provide a full command, you can always just run it directly by using start MS browser, and it's going to execute your command. So if you're looking at EDRs that will actually capture whatever you run in CMD, all they're going to see is start MS browser instead of the actual command. So it's just a way to actually hide it. So personally, if you want to do, I don't know, MS build or whatever, what I do is I'll register a new protocol handler like that. Then I'm going to have like WMI exec spawn, a version that does not capture the output, and I'll just run something like that where you run command, run DLL or start or whatever. And EDR will look at this and be like, yeah, there's nothing bad about it, because you literally hide whatever you're actually truly running inside of your protocol handler. And these are two ways of doing it. Start, if you use CMD, or run DLL32, you can use rel DLL and specify a file protocol handler, and you put whatever you want in here. You can even put garbage afterwards, it's going to be ignored, because it's not going to try to do anything with it because of how we define the protocol handler. Another cool thing too, if you have RDP sessions, so for example, remember when I showed you that you could actually do some interesting stuff on DCs? Well, you can technically just use Explorer and type MS browser, and it's going to actually execute it for you. So it's a fairly interesting way to really hide what you're going to actually execute from the command line perspective. So I don't know if you knew about this, but I found it fairly interesting. I'm not a huge fan of doing video, as ironic as it sounds, while I'm actually doing one. And I'm also actually really bad at documenting stuff in my repo, but it's pretty straightforward, right? You can just like run DLL, whatever you want in there. I guess I can probably do it live for you if you want. So you're gonna have an actual video of it. To install 254 update, not gonna happen. I just need to remember how my own tool is actually working. Yeah, so computer name, I'll just specify myself, command around handler, I guess. Okay, perfect. So PowerShell. Oops. Oops, I removed too much of it. Execute poison handler. Computer name, I'll just put myself, which may fail though, but sometimes it's complaining when you use localhost, and I guess for the sake of it, I'll just use calc.exe. We'll call this, I don't know, MS Red Team. always use this apps. I don't know why the hell it's trying to actually do this, but remotely invoking the product handler using cmd/c. So I guess I was probably also yeah, it was using WMI under the hood. So not sure why it complained about calc. I guess what I'll do is just specify something like cw Windows system 32 cmd.exe, and we'll call this ms handler 2. Why it's complaining? You need new apps to open this ms red team link. It looks like it doesn't come, but as you can see, definitely there's execution. I'm just wondering, let me check the registry real quick. Why it's like it doesn't feel like it's here for some unknown reason. Local machine, just need to remember myself, yeah, this is actually how it's get created. So it's local machine, I'm assuming, software, classes, ms, yeah, for some reason. Was it because I was not running this as an admin? That could be it. Silly me. Because you need to be admin, and obviously when you do lateral movement, you're always going to be admin on the remote system. It's not there, it's inside of poison. Just gonna change name to make sure. We'll call this 3. Import module. Here we go. So the reason why it was actually not spawned is because I was not running an admin, so I was not allowed to create the registry key. That's why you had the warning about the fact that it didn't know how to actually get it. But the beauty is, in this case, I was actually doing it on my own system, and I generally don't even remember that the tool was actually taking care of the WMI itself. So you'll notice here that there's an embedded C# aspect to it, which is just code here, so you had a reference to it, so it's actually going to take care of the registry key. Not going to go to too much details, but there is a remote registry key service that can be used. It's just that this service is not enabled by default, so I'd rather use a technique that will work all the time. So it was actually executing this, you provide credentials, and it's actually going to use by default run DLL32 as the remote way to spawn it, and it's going to just pass that to WMI. So the whole tool is creating the handler, and if you look at the process log, all you're going to see is this command here, which is less suspicious than having anything else that looks like it's really bad. But as I pointed out, what you could also do, because it's not registered, if you RDPN, you can just say explorer ms red team 3, I think they call it. You could just do that. Oops, I forget to have something. And you'll get your calculator pops. So good luck from a detection perspective to actually have any rules on something that is pretty random like that. So that's kind of the goal of it. Makes sense? Hopefully it answered your question. And lucky you can also have a recording of it with me goofing around, because I always forget that you need privileges in life to do such things. But the beauty is lateral movement doesn't matter, because to be able to bind on the RPCs for such service, you need to be local admin anyway. So it's never going to be an issue in real life. I was just doing it locally, and I didn't elevate my prompt, that's why. But hopefully you found this one interesting too. That's a little trick that I love to use. Of course, there's still it's not perfect in the sense that you still have DC RPC authentication, but there's really not much that you can do about it. You're also going to have to modify the registry key to register your handler. You're also going to call run DLL32 or spawn or whatever to actually trigger it. But that part doesn't really bother me because what you're going to do looks fairly legitimate, and you'll be surprised of the amount of time that run DLL32 is actually called under the hood. And you may have cmd.exe or whatever depending on what you do afterward. Side note, I kind of covered that earlier, but SMB and DCRPC are two different things that use two different ports. SMB is just a server message block, and it's used to encapsulate the authentication that can be used for file transfer and a bunch of other functionality. DCERPC is distributed computing environment and remote procedure call, aka execute whatever the hell you want on the remote system if you're allowed to. So it's important to make that distinction. As I pointed out, you don't need SMB to perform lateral movement. psexec.py case. If you're familiar with psexec, it's pretty much the same approach, just that the service name is slightly different. psexec.exe is always using the same service name, which is like psexec svc in capital. The psexec.py always register a random service. So if we take a look at it here, you're always going to have the authentication over SMB, and right away you have file transfer. It makes sense because you are going to register a service, so you have to actually push the service on the remote system. Then you're going to have the service registration, so a service will be registered. In this case, it's a random name that is tied to the random binary that was pushed over SMB. And you're going to have this service that is going to be spawned, and every time you execute a command, it's going to actually have a child process of CMD, which makes sense, right? Because you don't need anything else to run it since you register your own service to be able to execute file. psexec.py generate an arbitrary service name, as I pointed out. The other one is psexec svc. SMB exec is pretty much using the same approach. It's just that the service is slightly different, and it's always named by default BTO. So easy detection if you use the standard one. This one is hard coded in the actual code, so make sure that if you really want to use that technique, you change it. I personally do not recommend using that. As I pointed out earlier, the only case that will make sense is if they already use psexec, but make sure that you're using the official psexec.exe, not the psexec.py, because the service is slightly different, and it's going to create a new one with a different name, but you want to keep the original name and all that stuff, so it kind of blends inside of what they may expect to be legitimate traffic. So SMB authentication, once again, pushing executable, registering a service, and starting a service, and potentially CMD being spawned depending on the command that you run. All kind of stuff that you want to avoid, or at least keep in mind when you do it. The @exec case, it's actually fairly interesting, something that not much people use, but it's actually not that bad. SMB, once again, so if it's not blocked, you're good to go, and you have file transfer immediately over SMB3. What is transfer is the $1 million question. Any idea? Any idea of what is actually transferred? The answer is XML file. For those of you that are not familiar with tasks, they're actually just a bunch of XML file. Where you actually define whatever, when it's going to run, authentication, command, and argument. So you may recognize this. This is the template from the C# file. That's why it's not processed, but it's going to have the command is going to actually pipe it to a file and retrieve it over SMB. In this case, it's interesting because you just push the file, and the scheduled task will actually handle it for you. The cool thing about that is that you don't have much RPC traffic. All you need is SMB. So depending on what you're aiming for, it may actually be a bit more interesting since you don't have to really tamper much. You just drop a file on disk. Kind of thing. I remember that there's people that actually asked me in the past, it's like, hey, I have an arbitrary file, right, but I don't know how to get code execution. My advice is always to try to either override a DLL or push a scheduled task XML file on the system. Especially if you're running with a privileged context, you can always get that scheduled task executed if it's placed at the proper location in the task folder. Once again, SMB authentication, pushing file on disk, registering a scheduled task, and cmd.exe. So if the EDR is monitoring for scheduled tasks, that's a dead end, but it may be an interesting way of doing stuff. DCOM exec, it's literally leveraging COM as the name suggests. You're getting used to it. SMB, once again, and then we're going to switch to DCRPC because this is how you're going to actually initialize your COM object. You're going to have your remote create instance in here that is going to get the instance running. The $1,000,000 question is, what are we going to initialize? By default, it's going to be Excel. And if you follow through all of this and actually did an episode on COM object, you may have realized that this is looking a bit familiar. So we're going to actually get an instance of document inside of the Excel instance that was initialized through the Excel COM object. Then we're going to get inside of the application property inside of document, and then shell execute inside of it, which is a functionality that allows you to execute code. So if Excel is installed on the remote system, you can actually leverage it, and it's going to push commands through the shell execute. There's also other method that use macros on the remote system inside of the document, but in this case, it's literally just leveraging shell execute, which will lead to CMD execution and all that stuff. And what is going to be passed as shell execute is going to be the good old, pipe to localhost with a timestamp and all that. And the file is then going to be retrieved on the other side. Once again, SMB traffic to retrieve the output, which should not be there. And if you look at the command that is executed through DCOM, it's pretty limited. All you're going to see most of the time is that the DCOM launcher was actually initialized, which is not always present by default. So that could be an indicator that someone trying to do some DCOM over network. From a detection perspective, we have once again SMB authentication, initializing COM object over DCRPC, CMD being spawned, and file written to this. We mentioned WinRM earlier. This is actually a built-in functionality. The sad part about this one is that by default it's secure, even if it's using HTTP, because there's a trusted host list and it's always going to be empty. So if it's empty, you're not allowed to connect to it. Even if you're a domain admin, you're not going to get access if the trusted list is empty. The good news is if you come across a company that actually use it, they're not going to bother putting specific computers in the trusted list. They're just going to go with the wildcard and make sure that everybody can connect to it without having to troubleshoot. So it's either a miss or a perfect hit. There's no middle, personally. Based on what I've seen, it's one or the other. Cool thing is it's pretty much just over HTTP, and there's an actual built-in capability that allow you to connect to it with PowerShell. It's called PS session, so you can just establish it and run command on the remote system, and it's all going to be performed over HTTP. Another thing too, the 85 is the clear text version, 86 is the non-clear text. Remember when I told you about ARP spoofing and all that stuff? If you come across a client that actually use WinRM, you may be able to actually capture authentication through this, because over HTTP is going to be clear, so you may be able to capture some of the authentication exchange, which is something that you want. From a process perspective, there's not much to see because it's built in, so it's just the provider that's actually spawning whatever you want, so there's no registration or anything that need to be done because it's designed to do that. It's basically PSExec made by Microsoft. As I pointed out, WinRM is a feature, and unfortunately by default the trusted host is empty, so you can connect to it even if you're the main admin. If you look at it from a detection perspective, at the HTTP authentication, you're gonna have the WSMAN process, which is launched, which is I always forget what it stands for, but it's like Windows System Management Interface or something like that, which is also kind of related to PowerShell, the management, automation, DLL, and they're kind of close to each other, let's put it that way. And you may have CMD being spawned depending on which command you use. So this is an interesting example of me wanting to find a real fileless lateral movement technique. I wanted to find a technique that you can actually perform lateral movement without having to drop anything on disk, and obviously get rid of the SMB part of it. So what I did here is kind of think a bit, and I came up with this idea where instead of actually registering a service and push a binary, I'll just abuse of an already existing service. The idea is that service always have a bin path, which is pretty much what's going to be executed when the service is launched, and this is modifiable remotely. So this is pretty much what it does, right? You have the DCE EMP. This is just like related to SVCCTL, but long story short, you do the authentication and you get ready to initialize the SVCCTL, which is tied to the service management remotely. So you're going to open the service manager. Of course, you're doing lateral movement, so you're already granted with local admin privilege by design, because you're not capable of doing it if you don't have it. Then you're going to open a service of your choice, and you're going to actually change the config. Sorry. You're going to change the configuration to whatever you want, then you're going to start the service and revert it back to the original state. So from a Windows API perspective, this looks like opening it, open the service, query the service, change the service, start the service, revert it back to its original state. The cool thing about that is you can be 100% fileless if you use a vector afterward that does not drop a file on disk. Here's an example of a command that is truly fileless. If you use regsvr32, which is not something that I recommend now because this is a well-known identifiable techniques, but still the idea is that you're going to fetch the payload remotely and you're going to execute it without having to drop anything through your initial lateral movement technique. So as you can see here, I love to be verbose with my output. So you get an handle to the manager, you have an handle to the service, then you actually query the service, and you'll look for the binary path. This is what the default path looks like. Path looks like. Then you're gonna change it to whatever you want to execute. You're gonna change the service state. Usually I'm targeting servers that are not useful. This one is like the Xbox Live game service or something like that. You're not gonna find this one on servers, but if you're curious to see which kind of service you can be used, you can always just ask services to give you a list of service. So you may realize that by default there's a bunch of them that are actually, you know, like language experience service, for example, is probably a good one. It's not started, it doesn't do anything fancy, so you can just use that one. If you wanted to use MS-Build but needed to make sure web client was running, you could sometimes like cstart web client MS-Build blah blah blah. Yes, and the cool thing about MS-Build is that it actually support UNC path, so technically you could have MS-Build being executed remotely without having your MS-Build file being pushed on the remote system. Unfortunately, it doesn't work with HTTP, but it worked with UNC path, so you can host it on the share and get it fetched. But yeah. So that's pretty much how this techniques works. Personally, this is something that I use quite often during a real-life engagement. I do a mix of MS-Build and SC shell and have a lot of good success. Hey everyone, it was a pleasure to have you with us, and as usual, you're gonna have access to the recording, so hopefully you had a good time. But yeah, have fun and watch it when it's gonna be released tomorrow. Take care. So yeah, this one is also a bit limited in artifact because you only have DCE RPC authentication and a service that is modified. Most of the detection that was in place was actually looking for a service creation and all that stuff. So sometimes just the type of event slightly different will prevent detection from being in place, right? And the service is started. The cool thing about that is when I release it, someone at the RSA, which have their net witness agent, actually found this interesting, and they realized that when we first looked at this, we didn't have much in terms of detection, but with a prompt response from whoever that person is, William Mutley, from our content team, we produced an update to the DCRPC parser, and this is pretty interesting, right? Because they kind of document the fact that they had zero visibility when it comes to DCRPC, so they pretty much look at what are the events that they may expect, which are nothing's really suspicious, but they're trying to come up with the rules. So if service this, match this, action this and that, well, they're gonna actually get an alert. So you can always look at this and be like, is there a way to actually not match any of this, right? And they realized that it was pretty reliable because in real life, you're barely gonna see a pattern like that. So that's how they actually come up with the rules. And it's always nice at the end of the day that we also held them protecting. But these rules here are not always going to work well. There's probably other option. One mistake that I can think of is that they force the A inside of it. So if you use the W version of it, it's going to require a bit more work on your end, but it appears that this rule does not cover the Unicode version of it. So that's interesting to see why they hard coded it that way. But that will probably bypass the rule. So I don't know if you knew about that technique, but I found it quite interesting. Important note, this is why I think doing your own research and coming up with your own way of doing things will be valuable, since Defender Detect was in well-known. Sorry, I don't know what I wanted to say here. It doesn't make any sense. But point is, doing your own research and coming up with your own ways of doing things will probably make your life much easier as an attacker, because you wanted to actually come up with slightly different techniques that can be used. And in this case, once again, it's not an ODA, it's just a different technique, and there's still ways to actually detect it. So the whole point here is that your client should still be able to detect it. So that's always interesting to have a purple team exercise with them. It's like, okay, so I did that. You didn't detect it, so what can we do so you can actually identify it? And as you know, RS has shown, they just added some different layers of validation when it comes to DCERPC, because you may have realized that most of this technique end up calling DCERPC at some point. So having DCERPC visibility is quite useful. And another thing too, they cannot hook every single API that exists in Microsoft, because your computer is going to be unusable. So the thing is, if you're not super trendy, there's a good chance that you're not going to be hooked. But if your technique become extremely popular, there's a good chance that it's actually going to end up being hooked, and they're going to monitor it. So that's why I love to just do things on my own. Let's talk about Cobalt Strike case. PSExec is built in Cobalt Strike, and spoiler alert, you should never use any of the built-in lateral movement technique in Cobalt Strike. When it was originally written, it was extremely PowerShell oriented, so everything is pretty much executing PowerShell under the hood by default. PSExec options is pretty much the same as the legitimate one. The only major difference here is that it doesn't allow you to actually pick what you want to run. It's actually not true, but I mean, by default, it's always going to execute the PowerShell one-liner thingy that we played with yesterday. So if PowerShell is a concern to you, well, don't use that, because you're going to run PowerShell right away, which is something that you want to avoid at all costs, right? As I pointed out, by default, every lateral movement technique used involves PowerShell, which is something that you don't want to do. I strongly believe that when it comes to Red Team, if you're running PowerShell, you're doing it wrong. As I pointed out, if you're late in the engagement and your client has like zero detection, it's always nice to kind of increase noise and see where they actually start detecting stuff. That's the only cases where I will actually purposely run PowerShell, but early in the process, I will never run PowerShell. I recommend that you always use unmanaged PowerShell or something else if you can. So, speaking of lateral movement for Cobalt Strike, if you look at the beauty of Cobalt Strike is it's technically closed source, but it's Java, so it's fairly easy to actually take a look at the code. The point here is not to fully reverse the whole thing, it's just to have a better understanding of what's going on under the hood, because that's the downside of closed source. Sometimes you have to do your own research to understand what's happening under the hood, right? So for the WMI case, you'll notice here that there's something called PowerShell task, which is a good indicator that there's probably going to have some PowerShell involved. And the string that's going to be used is also PowerShell. So invoke WMI method Win32 process create is just going to create a process. So this is an actual PowerShell command. You could technically run this using unmanaged PowerShell and achieve the same. In this case, however, you'll notice that string 1 and param string 2 are actually coming from all the PowerShell magic that is there. So string 1 is PowerShell util build PowerShell command. That's a good indicator that you're probably going to face some PowerShell. And it's all going to be formatted in something that's going to be used as this command on the remote system. If you look at how the format works, you have this format command that will end up calling underscore format. And underscore format is just the PowerShell one-liner. That looks extremely familiar, where you're going to have the base64 PowerShell command that is the obfuscated shellcode in PowerShell. There's something important to note though. If you really want to use the built-in capability, you can actually override the way that the formatting is working. There's this thing that you can actually specify in a script. If you actually specify the PowerShell command manually, it's going to override it. If you check here, there's a little check. If string is null, it's going to call format. If it's not that, it's just going to use the string that is actually generated by PowerShell command. So you can override that and technically not use PowerShell if you want. It's a bit sloppy in the sense that you're still going to have to deal with all the base64 magic, but you can literally do whatever you want, right? Personally, what I do is just patch it and disable it completely. So if you have a more junior operator, even if they're trying to do it, it's just not going to do anything. So you define PowerShell command and you don't do anything with whatever you get provided with it. But you can always re-implement the whole concept. Notice here that if you skip that part, all the base64 PowerShell parent string is never going to perform anything. So that's a little trick here that you can use. You just define that in your script and you're good to go, in your aggressor script, and you'll be able to actually modify the way that it works. But keep in mind that under the hood, it's PowerShell right away. As I mentioned, advanced note, you can always use that instead of the default behavior. Based on all the information that we have, we may revisit the definition of stealth lateral movement technique. There's at least two things that you're going to be able to, you're going to have to do. You are going to have to authenticate at some points on the remote host, unless you found an OD or an exploit, but still you're going to have to connect to something. And you are going to have to run something at some point. There's literally nothing that you cannot do against these two. However, what you can limit your action to is authenticate, run something. So, you know, trying to gather the outcome of your command and all that stuff can be avoided, and it's going to make your life much more simpler. Building your own tool set is also the key. Remember, I just showed you about CobaltStrike WMI lateral movement technique. Well, technically, you could also still perform lateral movement inside of CobaltStrike, and this is something I wrote a long time ago when PowerShell was still fairly used. But I use it in a unmanaged approach, right? Long story short here, all I did is kind of re-implement WMI with my own little trick. So all you have to do here is that, in this case I'm just showing you in PowerShell, so it's more interesting to visually see it. But what I used to do in the past is just use unmanaged PowerShell to run this command, so at least the PowerShell is never spawned, and you still get WMI. And the major difference is the payload here in the original product was this, pretty much, right? Which was not modifiable when I started to do this. This was introduced much later on. But I have full control over the payload. So here I could specify whatever the hell I want instead of having the PowerShell part being glued to it. So once again, if you have a problem, there's always a solution. The other cool thing too, if you use unmanaged PowerShell, you don't even have to specify credentials. It's going to take whatever you're running to. And in this case, I was also supporting credentials, so no need to do pass the hash or make token or anything like that, and no need to have a privileged thing. That's the other thing too. By default, CobaltStrike required you to have a privileged shell to be able to do remote WMI because of some of the magic under the hood, but you don't necessarily need it if you actually pass the credentials to the command. So this one was also supporting just credential like username and password. And if you're curious to see what the code does, it's fairly straightforward. It's just called invoke WMI method, which is pretty much what we saw in here. And I even had it code that was not necessarily needed, but it's registered WMI events, so we can actually capture the PID. The reason why I did that is just I wanted to be sure that the command was successfully executed. So that was kind of my remote output kind of thing. So I knew that if the PID was created, at least something ran. If it was not, I probably fucked up somewhere. And here you also had two different conditions. So if I had creds pass as argument, and if they were not, it was just using whatever the process was running as. And once again, it's really a small piece of code, nothing really fancy here, but it was just my way of doing WMI without having to have PowerShell involved at all. Even if we used PowerShell syntax. Getting the command output is extremely expensive. I think I've probably mentioned that enough, so you should get that. Lateral movement command should be as simple as possible. All you want to do when you perform lateral movement is get access to something else. You don't want to do like remote reconnaissance or anything like that. You don't want to do post exploitation through lateral movement. You just want to get access and start working from whatever new access you gain. It's also important to note that what you run on the remote host matter. Once again, based on the behavior we observe, a payload may go through detection in place. Once again, EDR reconnaissance may help. Never assume that because you found that one system at XYZ install, the other one may have the same thing, right? So let's put it that way. If they detect process injection and memory shenanigan, my advice to you is whatever payload you're going to use, make sure that it avoid using shellcode execution. Which bring me back to stage 0 or whatever your little custom ruts that you may want to build for your practice, but make sure that it does not require shellcode for that kind of stuff. So personally, .NET with unmanaged .NET memory is probably the best option right now. Detect file on disk, like file creation and all that stuff, because there is some let's say older technology that still rely on file creation to create alert. Well, avoid blot on and all that stuff at any cost, because they're going to be able to detect the fact that you actually created a file on disk. To detect shady process, well, avoid using PowerShell or process reader that may be suspicious. So WinWord spawning, CMDU or PowerShell being spawned and all that stuff. This is usually where I'm going to rely on lolbin or stuff like that to actually get code execution. They have hook in place. Well, unhook the API or use API that are not hooked. I know that it sounds easy, but the reality is sometimes some of the functionality only have one way to be done at the kernel level, so you're going to end up having to unhook or just not use it. Don't be scared to create your own lab and adapt the available tool sets to remain as solid as possible. And this is an example of what I mean by that. So if you look at wmyexec.py, which is also publicly available, let me just find the link. There we go. I want you to tell me how you can actually make it more stealth. What I want you to do is get rid of all the built-in cmd/q and the output that add the piping to the file. So feel free to actually paste your solution in there, and whoever gets it first get a hard point. Do we have a winner? Someone is typing. Do you really need come spec? But most of the time you actually don't need CMD or come spec. And for those of you that are not familiar with what COP is mentioning, there's a environment variable called comspec, which actually point to CMD. So it was a little trick to actually obfuscate stuff in the past, but now it's as bad as CMD right away because everybody know about it. But you know, command prompt is so nice. I remember like 10 years ago I tweeted about this before it was cool, but I kind of did a typo and I was like, what? So if you put carrots, oops, 1 caret, it's actually just gonna make the command execute. The idea is that it's the escape character, so if you technically put whatever it's supposed to be afterward, it's gonna work. But if you just put 1, it's gonna be like ignored kind of thing. As long as you don't have 2 in a row, you're gonna be good to go. You can even do like stuff like that. You can really be creative with that. And the reality is, I know for a fact that you can actually reg save salmon system. Like you can do reg save sam or whatever h klm sam, oops, save. And they used to have detection, but if you just like, I don't remember the exact syntax, but if you do like stuff like that, you're gonna really achieve the same thing, but they're not gonna detect it. So sometimes it's super simple to defeat machine learning, air quote. So I guess I'll move to the solution. Pretty straightforward actually. This is what it looks like. So if you go into the remote shell part of it, you'll notice that shell is actually hard-coded to something. In this case here, I hard-coded it to I guess VR32 if you want, but technically what I recommend is to just leave it empty. There's no point for you to actually put anything in there. I'll leave you full control. So if you want to use a command to actually use CMD, well, just happen it in front of your command by yourself, but don't let the process do all of this. And you also notice here that you have a no output, which is set to false by default. Fun fact though, you can also pass this, change the state of this with a command argument. So it's always nice to you know, list all the arguments for a specific command. You may actually be able to realize that you can disable this by default, and you can confirm that no output is actually doing this by looking at the execute remote. If no output is false, aka if it's set to not to provide output. I don't know why they actually did it that way, but I would have probably said output is true, and anyway, set it to false, but kind of do the opposite. It's like a double negation to actually become a true statement. But point is, it's going to append all of the junk at the end of your command, and if it's not the case, well, it's just going to create your command with whatever you provided. So sometimes, you know, just taking a minute or two to actually check the tools will provide you with great information. Personally, what I'll do, if I was you as an internal team, I'll forward the packet and do those modifications. So remove the shell and force the no output to always be set to true by default, even if it can be passed as an argument. So a junior tester don't make too much noise without even knowing. And the point here is that if you remove that part, you're going to get rid of all of this and all of this, so you're just going to have whatever you type in here. So you have more control over what you're actually sending on the remote target. Make sense? Perfect. Just out of curiosity, any of you have actually forked of some of these tools internally for that exact reason, or this is not something that you guys do? I guess, do you fork internally? Not really. I think it's really a good practice personally, for that exact reason. Sometimes it's just to kind of put real guard on the whole tool set to make sure that people that are not necessarily as familiar as you with the tool can actually get there and make sure that they don't make the mistake, and you can always educate them. Personally, that's something that I do. As you may have noticed, I've created a lot of content, so I usually present it also where I work to try to educate the more junior resources. I really believe that education is the key here. You can also bypass detection by leveraging trusted binaries. This is probably nothing new to you, but keep in mind that there's plenty of it, and there's probably tons of it that still can be discovered, right? The lol-based project that contains a bunch of lol bin is actually extremely complete, right? Finally, make sure that you understand what your toolset is doing in the background is really the key. My best advice is if you write your own, well, it's probably going to help. But if you're going to use stuff that is public, like Strike, you can take, a couple of hours here and there to take a look at the source code and be like, okay, this is how it actually works, and now I understand why this is happening and all that kind of stuff. Architecture matter. You can inject 86 into 64 and vice versa. This is something important. I'd say that probably 90% of the time that someone's like, hey, use your payload generator internally and it doesn't work, and like, did you check the architecture? And the answer is always no, and this is the cause of it. So they're trying to run 64 shellcode inside of a 32-byte process and vice versa. This is happening all the time. Keep in mind that it's not entirely true, as we kind of cover. Evan gate, Hellgate, and all that stuff can actually be used. In fact, as I pointed out, 64-bit Windows always execute in 64-bit, even if it's a 32-byte process. So it's going to actually switch using the WAL64 to actually load 32 bytes afterward. But every process is actually 64, so you can actually kind of use that to get execution of different architecture and fool some of the EDR. But we're not going to go to too much detail here, but this is possible. And that's why if you look at the syscall, they have an interesting structure that also check for 32-byte instruction. Anyway. So the PowerShell PowerShell stager, remember this one? One of the things that you want to consider when you have the proper architecture is because you want to make sure that this check here is not going to make you spawn a unexpected PowerShell. So if you want to make sure that you're in 32 or 64 byte, make sure that you actually have the proper code. If you want to confirm what this is actually returning, if the size is 8, it means that it's 64 byte, and you can always check 4 is 32, 8 is 64, and you can always run it on environments. So it means that in this case, if your shellcode is 64, the payload will always start a 32 byte instance. If you're doing this, it's actually going to be a bit of a problem unless your shellcode is 64 and whatever you generated is 64. So this check was actually added to make sure that it's going to work, and that's the thing with publicly available framework like that. And we actually had an interesting conversation with Joe Vest in the past. Most of these features are actually there for usability, so they assume that you don't really know what you're doing, and if you fucked up, well, the whole code will try to save you from it. So if your shellcode is not matching the proper architecture, it's going to take care of spawning a process with the proper architecture. Keep in mind that by default 64-byte shellcode is actually going to run inside of a 64-byte PowerShell. So technically, if you just put 32-byte shellcode in there, it's going to do the magic for you, because PowerShell is most likely going to be spawned as 64-byte default. That's the reason why they had such a check. So if you generate your shellcode in 64, you're going to be good. And the reason why architecture is critical in that case is because you're actually going to end up running shellcode in memory, as we saw yesterday. So if you don't have the proper permission, well, it's going to fail miserably, because you're going to try to execute instruction in a context that does not understand them. This also applied to MSBill, because you can actually also compile in 32 and 64. There's a bit of a danger with that, because you also have the any architecture by default that may confuse you. It's technically not really any architecture. So I rather personally specify that I want 64 or 32 when I actually compile my stuff. But point is, if you are executing 64-byte shellcode, just make sure that you use the framework 64 versus the 32. And once again, you can run pretty much the same check with the pointer check, and you'll see that the normal one is 4 and the other one is 8, which is a good indicator that you're in a 64-bit environment. This may sound extremely confusing, but why not making this actually even worse, and we'll cover that too. System32 folder actually contain the 32-byte version of it, and syswall64 actually contain the 32-byte version of it. Technically, System32 is the original folder, so this is where they keep the native one. So everything that is native now on Microsoft, aka everything that is 64-byte, and now everything is 64-byte, is going to be in System32. Everything that is 32-byte, because syswall is the part that is actually used to execute 32-byte, is going to be in there. I know it's confusing, but it is what it is. And because they love to follow their own standard, for .NET, it's the opposite, right? Everything that is 32 is in the normal one, and 64 is actually in the 64 one. You're probably going to forget that a couple of times, but that's okay. It gets confusing, but 32 is in 64 unless it's .NET. Does it make sense? As weird as it sounds. You could have probably named this syswall32 or whatever. I don't know. So what are my options to run codes, especially if I'm dealing with COBOL Strike? There's a bunch of options, right? Execute assembly, PowerShell, PowerPick, shell, inline execute, buff file, or inject into another process, right? Which one are the one that you want to use, right? Execute assembly is a popular one. It allows you to load a .NET executable in memory without touching the disk. I'll get into a bit more details later on, but the beginning of the code is actually just parsing the file, making sure it's actually a .NET file. So if it's not, it's just going to tell you that you don't know what you're doing. And then it's actually going to send the information to the beacon, so it's going to execute assembly job. I want to point out here the dot spawn, which is really what is going to be important later on. But every time you see dot spawn, it's pretty bad in the sense that this is once again for functionality reason. COBOL Strike will always spawn a sacrificial process for some of those functionality. The idea is that it's not going to kill your actual beacon. So if you do something wrong with here, you're not going to lose your session. As this says, one beacon is like 0 beacon, right? So make sure that every time you run a command, if you want to avoid process injection, well, don't use anything that do spawn. And spoiler alert, execute assembly is actually spawning a sacrificial process. So that's one of the reasons why you may actually get detected. Spawn sacrificial process is going to be launched. Keep that in mind. And there's a bunch of functionality in COBOL Strike that actually use spawn. So back to execute assembly. As you can see here, the constructor is just calling a job simple constructor, which is taking care of preparing all the information file architecture on the remote system. Then the constructor simply set the task here according to the argument, so it's basically preparing everything, nothing really fancy here. The real juicy here is happening inside of the spawn, where it's actually gonna get the content. It's actually gonna reflective load it and push it inside of the remote process. You'll notice here that there's set command that are tied to some specific ID. This is where those ID are actually quite interesting. So if we look at the one that we saw earlier, like 71 or 81, you'll notice that it's command job spawn x64, and 88 is like command job spawn token. So it just depends on the state. But keep in mind that those builders are gonna tell the agent running on the remote system to actually spawn the sacrificial process, inject into it. And you also have big hints about that. Obfuscate, post exec, obfuscate, setup, smart inject. So definitely you're doing process injection when you're doing this, and this is what spawn does under the hood, which is something that you want to avoid, especially if you have an EDR that is good at picking up remote process injection. PowerShell, I guess I'm not going to spend too much time in here. It's obviously going to spawn PowerShell. You may remember the PowerShell task. So it's going to create a PowerShell task. It's going to actually run the command, so it's just literally going to execute PowerShell, and you're pretty much going to have the other formatting, and you can also redefine PowerShell command. Keep in mind that everything that you send to the agent is going to be basics4 encoded PowerShell kind of thing. If you use that approach, that's why it always ends up like that. So it just kind of encode your command for you when it's run. That's why sometimes when you get an error message, you'll be like, why I see this massive one-liner, is because it was converted to a PowerShell one-liner under the hood. If you use unmanaged PowerShell to run PowerShell without invoking PowerShell, you'll notice here that you still have the PowerShell task, which makes sense, and you're going to have the PowerShell job and another spawn. So depending on the architecture, it's going to spawn the proper process tied to it. but it's another good indicator that unmanaged PowerShell is actually going to be spun once more. You can even see it here in the in the code that at the end of the day is gonna get a DLL. So it's either the PowerShell 64.1 or the 32-byte version. Keep in mind that the latest version of this has changed a bit though. The way that they actually keep the resource are slightly different, but it's pretty much the same concept in the sense that you're still gonna inject something in the remote process. Notice here that you also have the disable patch. That can be applied, so you may actually force it to actually disable AMSI. And there's something that is actually really unclear to me. Is it actually disabling AMSI in the source process or the remote process? Generally, it's really unclear. My understanding is actually doing it in the remote process, but purely based on the code, it's really not clear because it's tasked inside of your own process, which kind of make no sense to disable MSI. You want to disable it in the remote process because this is where you're going to do your magic, right? Speaking of that DLL, what it actually does under the hood is pretty straightforward. If you want to run PowerShell, you need to have a .NET environment, right? As we saw, we need to be able to call the management DLL, which is a .NET DLL. So first things first, you need to actually initialize the CLR environment, which is the command language runtime, aka the virtual machine component of Microsoft .NET framework that is going to be able to process your C# code. So if you look at the DLL, first things first, CLR create instance, so you're just actually initializing it, and you're actually going to bind to it, so you're kind of getting ready to actually send information. I'm not going to go to too much of the details, but just assume that afterward you're going to receive the data as a parameters, and you're going to be able to actually execute PowerShell. I'll show you what the unmanaged PowerShell command looks like later on. But what I want to put your attention on is because you're creating a sacrificial process that is not tied to your parent, how the hell can you actually retrieve the output? Well, here's the answer. Namepipe. Namepipe are used for inter-process communication. And it's basically like a file, but it can also be queried over the network. So you can technically connect to different systems using namepipe. The issue here, it may be pretty obvious. The namepipe name is hard-coded in the DLL, so it's always going to be pipe PowerShell. It's a super simple indicator for EDR. So this is an example of something that you want to customize. You probably want to rewrite your own unmanaged PowerShell. Personally, if I have to run unmanaged PowerShell, what I'll do is use unmanaged.net and have my little utility that pretty much achieves the same, but it's inside of my own process, so I don't have to do all the pipe, and I don't have to deal with the hard-coded pipe name PowerShell, because it's pretty straightforward to detect. As I mentioned, pipe name are cools, but they can also be used to exchange information between system, and this is how the SMBP can work. So you can actually compromise a system that doesn't have any internet connectivity by establishing connectivity between two systems using namepipes. So you compromise system A, which have access to the internet, and system A is actually talking to system B that doesn't have internet access through the namepipe internally. So that's how it actually works. You can also run unmanaged PowerShell via C# directly. As I pointed out, all you really need is this. So you could have a little .NET utility where instead of having a hard-coded script, you can pass it as an argument. So you pass your script as an argument, or it can be an URL, so it's actually fetching out runtime, whatever you want. But point is you really don't need much to actually be able to run unmanaged PowerShell if you're inside of a .NET environment. All you have to do is create the run space, create the pipeline, add whatever script you want to run, and you can capture the output by looping through the output of the invoke, which is PowerShell object that can be converted to text. It's really not that big of a piece of code. If you run shell, someone mentioned ComSpec earlier. That was one of the techniques that was used in the past to actually obfuscate the fact that you are using cmd.exe. But the thing is, sometimes if a technique gets too popular, it's as bad as if it was using CMD, right? Because there's pattern that can be observed. And I remember we had a conversation with Waldo regarding ComSpec, and he mentioned that this is not even a real good detection rules if you have that in place, because it's crazy the amount of actual tools that under the hood use ComSpec instead of CMD. But yeah, it is what it is. There's a lot of product that will detect on CommSpec instead of CMD. But if you use shell, you're literally just gonna build a command, so com shell and /c and whatever you want to execute afterward. It's nothing really fancy here. It's pretty straightforward execution. Keep in mind that several commands will inject process in memory. So any Mimikatz related command, spawn command that executes shellcode, pass the hash, keylogger, inject, obviously by design, hash dump, DC sync, browser pivot, or some of the functionality that actually do it. All the unmanaged stuff too, so unmanaged PowerShell, unmanaged C#, as you saw. So these are some of the other example of command that you may have used in the past that actually end up creating sacrificial process. So you may want to keep that in mind. And if you're curious to see which one are actually going to do it, if there's a new version that introduces a new feature, I highly recommend that you take a look at the code, and you'll see that in the beacon util.java or class or whatever, there's always a function that is going to be a wrapper for whatever functionality, and you're going to see the spawn pretty quickly. You know, like these, as you can see here in the file, it's always like shell, PowerShell and manage, so it's pretty straightforward. It's usually a small piece of code, and you're always going to see the spawn or something like that if there's any. Usually it's only going to be in this, so if you don't see it, there's a good chance that this functionality doesn't do any spawn. Keep in mind that spawn under will also execute PowerShell. That's something really interesting. It's like most of the lateral movement. If you do spawn under, aka spawn a process and another user under the hood, what it's going to do is actually going to run PowerShell. As you can see here, you have the PowerShell utility and the PowerShell download cradle. You may be familiar with that, but Cobalt Strike to actually deliver PowerShell, even if you're using unmanaged PowerShell, will spawn a web server in memory, and it's actually going to serve the file that way. So everything is going to be downloaded through the PowerShell cradle. By default, as you can see, it used to be hard-coded to 127.0.0.1. Back then, people were actually patching the Java code to be able to change that to something else because it was an easy detection. And someone mentioned FireEye EX, for example. I know that this is one of the detection that they used to have. You know, a download cradle that point to 127.0.0.1 is a good indicator because nobody does that normally, right? So one of the solution was to actually change that to something like, you know, 127.0.0.3. And under the hood, the PowerShell download cradle will always create the good old execute invoke expression uObject web client download string, where it points to the server that was spawned in memory. Yes, there's plenty of options. The beauty now is that you can actually customize that using one of the features. So if you don't do it, I highly recommend that you do so. It's to define it in an aggressor script where you actually set PowerShell download cradle to something else, right? Be creative as much as you want. But point is, you can now fully customize it. So you're going to say that, hey, the download cradle is not going to look like that. So you're going to replace the data to something that is known to something that you pick. You could even have like a bit of random in there. So every time you actually do it, it's going to use a different format. As you guys are pointing out in the chat, you don't even have to use the full version. It can be like 127.1.2.3. Actually, you can actually also change that 0, if I remember correctly, to pretty much whatever the hell you want, and it's gonna work. So you can generate arbitrary address that looks like localhost, but they're not localhost. So detection based on the fact that the download cradle is reaching out to 127.0.0.0.1 is fairly easy to bypass if you know that it support download cradle. Make sense? Wonderful. So I guess that was a lot of information. It's already 4, so let's take a 15-minute break, and we're gonna jump to buff file and much more stuff again. So we'll regroup at 4:25, and we're getting there. How many official slides there is? 526, and we're at slides 484. So we're definitely going to reach the end, probably as expected around 5:30 or something like that. So that's really the last stretch. So let's regroup at 4:25. Qu'est-ce que tu dis? J'entends pas. And we're back. You guys are ready for the last stretch? I know it's Friday. I don't know if it's sunny outside, but we're getting there. So let's get started with the last part. So lateral movement, as mentioned, if you're using CoWalls, you probably want to spend a bit of time using buff file. If you're not familiar with it, I'll try to kind of give you a quick intro and some tips and tricks that I personally use. Keep in mind that you can run a command using inline execute to execute C file pretty much. The cool thing about that, which is even better, is that it doesn't spawn sacrificial process. And I really wish that CoWalls offered you an option where you don't have to actually spawn a sacrificial process to run some focus command. Hopefully one day they're going to have such a feature that will help executing some of those features without having to be scared of process injection, all that stuff. That being said, buff file or literally just C file pretty much. It's just that the syntax is slightly different because of the fact that you're just compiling it and you're not linking it. When you're actually compiling exe, you compile it and you link it afterwards. So this is where all the import export table is filled and the structure of execution is set. If you compile it, you're just pretty much compiling the code to get the assembly out of it. That's why you need to find a way to actually resolve all the import, and that's what the buff feature is actually doing under the hood. So most buff tutorial will force you to rewrite your code to port it. So here's an example. Instead of using printf, you're gonna have to use beacon printf, and every Windows API that you need to involve need to be declared using that kind of syntax here, where you specify the API and you have to kind of import it on your own. And if you look at the original code here, this is what it looks like. So it's a bit harder and it takes a bit of time. And personally, I'm a huge fan of not refactoring my code as much as possible. I'd rather use the same code and find a way to get it run without having to modify it that much. So here's two little tricks that will probably save you a bunch of time. Redefine printf to beacon printf. The idea here is that you're actually going to keep all the printf in your code. It's just that you're going to use a little macro to actually convert this into beacon printf. And you're also going to initialize all the APIs using getproc address and load library. There's also a limitation with buff where if you have more than 40 or something like that declaration, it's going to kind of run out of space. So by using getproc address and load library, you don't even have to worry about that, which is another plus. I don't remember the exact number, but I think it's like 40 or 50, something like that. I don't know if any one of you have actually run into that issue while writing buff file, but if you do, it's quite annoying, right? So simple C macro to actually redefine printf. Here it is. It's really just that. So you define printf format argument, and the dot dot is just an expression in C that means that the number of argument is unknown, because technically you can pass more than one argument to printf because of the formatting. And you're going to say that every time you see printf, it's actually going to be this, which is going to be converted to beacon printf callback output, which is the typical syntax that you'll find like here. And you're going to pass the format because it's literally the same thing, and you're going to expand the argument. Once again, I'm not the one that decided the syntax, but if you want to expand all the arguments, you just have to use # args. And keep in mind that macros are actually modifying the code at compile time. So when you compile it, it's just going to find all the instances of printf in your code. It's going to replace it with beacon printf. It's not like this code is actually going to exist. It's just going to do the replacement for you, so you don't have to refactor all your code. The other thing that I was mentioning is resolving all the API using resolver, which means that you don't have to change anything in your code. All you have to do is actually create a little resolver that take the DLL and the function that you want to actually resolve as arguments. Here you have to define kernel32 and kernel32$ because that's the syntax that is supported by the compiler, which means that at runtime it's going to have to do all the legwork, but this is the only instance where you're going to have to like write your code differently. So all you have to do is add the define and the resolver at the beginning of your code and you're good to go. So if you look at what it looks like, if you want to call get current process ID, for example, all you have to do is add it at the beginning, and you have your resolver that resolve the API and the DLL, and your code will look exactly the same because get current proc ID is actually defined by the resolver that you put in place. So you have to add this extra line here, but the rest of the code remain the same. Make sense? Wonderful. Another slight change is how you actually process the argument. Unfortunately, you cannot just go with main and process the argument. You have to use this data piece structure, and it's actually not that hard, right? The classic C will look like this char argument and argv of 1 or whatever. In this case, you have to call the beacon data parse and parse whatever was provided to it. So in this case, if you had 2 arguments, you're going to call it data extract parser, and you're going to get it set in there. Then you're going to call it, and the second time it's going to put the argument here. How does it actually work? It's fairly simple. If you're familiar with prepared statement and stuff like that, in memory the data will be packed using a certain format, right? So if it's binary data, you're going to specify that it's B. If it's integer, it's going to be high, S for short, Z for zero terminated encoded, and capital Z for wide char. So it kind of know what to expect from a memory perspective, because the beacon will have like all the data packed in memory using a certain structure. So the buff understand what it's actually looking like. So if it's a pointer of data, is it a pointer to an integer? It's a pointer to an array of data. Is it Unicode or NC pretty much? So if you want to invoke your buff file with arguments, you have to do a little Argosar script that will actually take care of packing it. So here's an example of one that take one argument, which is a standard NC string. What you do is you actually read the file with the buff. So you're going to have to drop that file on your team server. You're going to read it, and then you're going to specify what the argument looks like. So you're going to use the pack, and each argument is going to be defined by one of the letter, right? So in this case, there's only one argument, so it's going to be Z. If you had multiple arguments, you can Z, I, B, whatever. You can do a mix of both, pretty much like you do with prepare statement. And then you're going to call beacon and line execute under the hood with the data, which is the actual beacon file itself. The Go function, it's kind of weird though. You can always modify it that most of the people online use Go, but you could technically use main if you want, as long as you define that it's main here and you define it as main here. So you don't even have to refactor your main, only the way that you process the argument in your code. But that's pretty much how it works in like 3.5 seconds. But if you apply those concepts, you're going to be able to fairly easily build buff file. And what I highly recommend to you is to actually always do the C version of it. When it's actually fully working, you can port it with buff. If you use those tricks, it should be pretty painless. And then a good example of that is the trusted installer privilege escalation thing. You have the version in C that we kind of briefly covered that looks like that. This is just pure C. And if you look at the buff, notice that it pretty much looked the same, right? The only difference is that some functions have the resolving for this. I still use printf and all because I actually define it here as I pointed out. But apart from that, the only extra function that we have is the resolver and these where it's actually gathering the pointer to those functionality. But apart from that, the code has not changed. So to me, it's a quick way of creating different buff or C file that looks exactly the same. In this case, as I pointed out too during the presentation, I use set thread token instead of spawning process with token because you want your thread to actually have the privilege. That's pretty much the only difference code wise. So it's really not that hard. to actually port your beacon file that way, your object, your C file to buff file. Sorry. Another cool feature that was introduced a fairly long time ago, because we're now at version 4 or 6 or something like that. In 3.14, it actually introduced a new feature called block DLL. There is an actual functionality in Microsoft that is called process creation mitigation policy block non-Microsoft binary always on. Simply put, it prevents other process to actually inject themselves inside of your process. The only downside with that is on paper it's cool, but in reality it doesn't really have much impact because most of the EDR DLL are actually cross-signed with Microsoft, so they're trusted. As you can see here, it says that non-Microsoft binary always on, so it means that if it's not Microsoft, it's not going to load. But if the EDR DLL is actually signed by Microsoft, it's not going to prevent it from executing. The idea here is that what you can do is have your own process that launch itself again and change the attribute and make sure that you actually specify that in the startup info when you call process. So if you're curious, you actually have the source code in here for the block DLL. I think I have it somewhere too, so I can probably show it to you. I think it's like Red Team C code or something like that. I guess I don't, so let me just get it from here. Block DLL. Of course, I'm not authenticated anymore. Sorry, I'm having a hard time typing my password. Here we go. Okay, so first thing first, we have multiple things, so I'm not going to cover but that's the debugging thing. Remember I told you that you can actually spawn yourself in debugging mode and check which DLL are loaded. You also have this code in here. What is interesting here is the actual main part. Notice here that if arguments is smaller than 2, you're actually going to fall into that code. So if it's invoked without argument, you're going to get there. If it's actually with argument, it's going to be there. So as you can see here, it says do some dirty stuff here, which means that second execution is going to have a different state. And long story short is, first thing is going to actually prepare the argument, aka running itself with an argument. The value here doesn't have to be anything really interesting, as long as it's there to actually go into the health. But the underlying concept here is that you're actually going to end up calling a create process on yourself. But the only difference is that you're going to pass a structure here, which is the startup info, which contain the policy. So update proc thread attribute. This is where you're actually going to put the thread attribute mitigate policy in place. So you're going to be able to actually force this to be set. So when you spawn yourself again, after you did nothing malicious except forcing this to be set, you're going to be able to execute your code, which is here. But in this case now, if anything trying to inject itself inside of your own process, if it's not signed by Microsoft, it's not going to work. So for less popular EDR that don't have the luxury to be signed by Microsoft, you're literally going to prevent them from injecting their DLL inside of your own process. So that's a really neat trick if you're not familiar with it and you already have the code to play with it. And if you're interested to see all the debugging yourself thing too, you also have the code in there. So it's a mix of both pretty much. This will prevent DLL not signed by Microsoft to be loaded. Keep in mind that like CrowdStrike, for example, Carbon Black, and the most popular one are actually cross-signed by Microsoft, so it's not going to prevent anything. But you still do the debugging thing to actually prevent some of these to actually be executed inside of your process by tempering it. What you can do is let them load, but you can also empty the memory location and do all kind of magic, since you control everything about the DLL being loaded because you're pre-main call when you're debugging yourself. As I mentioned, writing your own C2 and lateral movement payload may avoid detection too. An example of something that I did was ThunderShell, right? As I pointed out, it only uses unmanaged PowerShell and does not a shellcode stager. That was purposely designed like that, so I don't have to worry about all the memory magic and all that stuff. So I highly recommend that you give it a try. If you want to take a look at the canvas, you can probably look at ThunderShell. There's a bunch of other alternatives. It's been abandoned a bit because I have a much better version in the cooker. I may actually release them one day, but I don't want to get into the C2 framework fighting game, so not sure I'm gonna actually ever release it. It's pretty common that password will be used to connect to on the remote host, right? There's an alternative to that. My point is, it's appealing to actually dump people's credentials because it feels like you know a bit about their private garden. But the reality is that you don't need credential most of the time, right? Pass the hash, pass the ticket is still quite useful, right? So you don't necessarily need to run Minicast. If you can avoid running it, you should actually avoid it as any cost, because once again, it's a super popular tool. There's a lot of detection in place. Perfect example of that, you can always DC sync credentials when you have domain admin credentials, so you can do it remotely. No need to do it. Notice here that you're actually technically running Minicats under the hood, but the major difference here is that you're actually going to target a different system. So if you run it on a system that you know for a fact it's not monitoring, like I mentioned earlier, like a 2008 server, and you know that all their DCs are like 2016 with an EDR in place, if you do it remotely, at least whatever you're doing locally is not going to be detected, which is a nice thing. So you can always capture the NT hash of whatever user account if you do DC sync, and you can just pass that hash later on. Another thing that you can do too is Kerberos. This is a perfect example where all the certificate thing with ADCS, you can actually request a certificate, and you can actually request a ticket, which is a Kerberos ticket. You can always take that ticket to try to get the hash out of it, especially if you load it with Rubius. But the reality is most of the time you can literally just use that ticket and load it in memory. And I was actually considering probably making an episode on loading Kerberos ticket in memory, because it actually does not require much work. It's just using some of the LSAS API that are designed to actually load a ticket. And that could be probably useful, especially if we port it to a buff or something like that. As I pointed out, I know that password appealing, but stay away from Mimikatz if you can, especially on a system that is highly monitored. It's easy to detect Mimikatz for several reasons. First, it's touching LSAS, then it's also importing a bunch of DLL in a sequence that is highly predictable and easy to fingerprint. Kerberos can be used by impersonating another process token. That's probably the case where I'd say that injecting inside of a remote process is what you want to do. So let's say you compromise the server with local admin, lateral movement, or something like that, and you want to actually impersonate a process that's running as a domain admin. This is probably where you want to inject yourself, right? So you inject inside of it, and you're going to impersonate someone. Nano Rubius buff for managing. Oh, nice. So it's probably relying on LSAS, I'm assuming, under the hood. Pass the ticket is probably where it's happening. Yeah, LSAS lookup authentication. Okay, that's what I was. Yeah. So I guess you kind of get the idea, but I can still present code like that. That works the same. But thanks for sharing. Yeah. You can also generate a golden ticket and use a token within your Cobalt Strike beacon using Kerberos. Use CC cache, for example, Ccache, so you can actually cache your ticket inside of your own instance. Personally, I'll be extremely careful with the golden ticket, because technically they're valid for 99 years, and it doesn't mean that your client is going to be resetting their KRBTGT password, right? And for those of you that are familiar with it, you have to reset the DC twice after you change the password to make sure that it's actually going to be changed and take effect. Personally, when I dump KRBTGT, I'm always going to inform the client first, and we also have a rules of engagement that tell them that we may do it, especially with pitspatam, where the easiest path is to actually just pitspatam and get the hash or replay it, and replay it against the DC, or crack the hash and just connect to the DC and do a secret dump, which is basically getting the hash, and instead of dumping all of them, you just dump the KRBTGT, so you can DC sync whatever the hell you want afterward. From an attacker perspective, that's the easiest path, but it involves also leaking the KRBTGT hash. Keep in mind that all of this can also be done remotely, so if you want to avoid having anything running on the remote system, it's always nice to SOX proxy most of the functionality. Once again, Impacket is here to help you. You can actually use Ticketer to actually request a ticket if you have all the information needed. You can also use Rubius to perform pass the ticket. It's actually super simple. You can list the ticket and pass it. It's super well documented in their GitHub page. This is usually what you're going to do, right? So you're going to try to get a ticket, upload it, and actually submit it. The Rubius by default is going to ask you for the base64 representation of it, and it's going to be loading it inside of your session so you can impersonate whatever ticket you ended up using. In conclusion, lateral movement is an art. Choose the right method to avoid being detected, and remember these little tricks. Most rat will perform process injection, memory injection, especially if the architecture is not the right one. So make sure that you're using the proper architecture and don't let the framework handle this under the hood, because it's going to end up probably spawning something that you don't want to be spawned. Make sure you perform reconnaissance before doing anything complex. Make sure you understand the exploit and what it's going to actually spawn or create or leave as an IOC. Don't be scared to spend time analyzing, modifying your tool set. I know that it may be painful and not as fun as, getting a shell, but it's quite important because your shell afterward is going to be even more rewarding, especially when you don't get detecting. And payload crafting is really an art on its own. Take time trying to learn how to actually do it. I'm assuming that you guys are interested in learning more since you joined my Patreon. So once again, watch the video again and again if they were not clear, and trying to come up with some ideas by looking at them. It's going to really pay off on the long run, that's for sure. Side loading is also quite useful. I've mentioned themes a lot of time yesterday, and this is exactly what we're going to look at for right now. So side loading is useful to launch malicious code, and it can also be used as lateral movement. Remember that I told you that you can also just use SMB. So if you don't want to execute anything remotely, all you can do is SMB and drop a file in there. There's multiple options, and one of them that is quite interesting is actually app domain. You just have to drop a file, and eventually when the file is going to be launched, it's going to load whatever you specify in there. So it's always a nice lateral movement to just drop a file and wait for execution, right? It's a bit trickier on servers because there's less user interaction, but still, it's something to keep in mind. So the whole point of DLL side loading is to actually find a DLL that can be loaded, that will load a DLL inside of a folder that you can write as a regular user. The beauty of it is that you don't necessarily have to be an admin to be able to do some DLL side loading. Here's a perfect example, for example, of Word. There's plenty of DLL that will be loaded, so you may notice that it's actually going to try to get some DLLs, and some of these are actually located in a user control folder. I'm allowed to read-write this specific folder here. So VC runtime 100, 140 and _1, MS VCP 140 are actually trying to be resolved in my current folder, which means that from an attacker perspective, even with low privilege, I could force WinWord to load this. The reason why you want to do side loading is purely to get code execution in a trusted process, right? I'm thinking of app whitelisting and all that stuff. If you can get your DLL running inside of WinWare, well, you're going to defeat the whole app locking thing because you just force a trusted binary to actually run your payload. There's a thing too that is actually super popular. It's app data folder. App data is actually used by Microsoft from my understanding to actually allow tools to be installed and being updated without having privilege access needed. The idea is that most of the tools were used to be installed in program file, but if you want to update it yourself, you cannot because you need administrative privilege. In corporate environment, you're not going to have such privilege by default. App data was kind of there to solve that. Each user have their own app data, which is read-write executable by all the users. The issue with that, as you may have realized, is that you can literally modify everything you want with those files, including side loading. And you don't even have to expect to find a DLL that have a writable path, because technically the file is going to be run through this folders and you have full privilege, but you'll see that in a second. And actually find one not too long, well, I mean, it's been a while, but I kind of documented that the updater for teams allow you to actually run arbitrary command. And the cool thing is, just a bit of background on Teams, it's actually use Electron, which is Node.js based, and Electron come with a default updater called Squirrel. In this case, it was called update.exe. But point is, this is a .NET application that actually end up running Electron under the hood, right? So you can always get the Node.js code out of it. And as part of the code, you'll notice here that the actual application support like process start and process argument, and they even validate that there's no canonicalization attack, which means that if you provide // or anything like that, it's actually going to fail, right? The point here is that if you try something like this, process start // and escape the folder, it's not going to work. Because it was preventing this kind of thing. Of course, they will perfectly work in a normal C program file, limited permission scenario. The biggest issue that we have here is that because it's an app data, we have full control over the folder. If you look at the folder for Teams, for example, app data, local Microsoft Teams, you'll notice here that myself have full control over the folder. If you look at something inside of program file, myself have really limited privilege, which is pretty much read execute. The fact that we have full privilege kind of defeat the whole check in here, because what you have to do is just drop a file in the folder and you can do it right away. And if you actually check the documentation, well, they changed the layout for sure, but you can literally just do this, right? So you can definitely tell that it's me. Whatever ours is definitely me. My type of syntax. Anyway, point is that you can put whatever you want in here as pointed out, so you just copy your payload in there since you're allowed to do it, and then you just process start, and you're going to have a process being spawned by update, which is a signed trusted binary. And you also have a remote one that was actually fixed now. Fun fact, we were two people that actually discovered it at the same time, but we kind of realized that one of them was not public, but I kind of talked about it. I was like, damn. Anyway, so you could also download an arbitrary file with Teams back then, but this one has been addressed. So what about DLL loaded by Teams, right? Let's take a look at it. This is Teams. As you notice here, we're in the user, Windows, admin, app data, local, Microsoft Teams, current. And these are all the DLL that are attempted to be loaded. They're in the folder, which makes sense. This is always what they're going to look for. But the thing is, you have full control over that folder. Notice here that most of them are not found, because the reality is they're going to be found inside of the actual System32 folder. This is just like the load library search sequence. It's always going to be current folder, System32, and the other location that I always forget. So they're going to look for your current folder first, then they're going to move on to System32. That's why you get a bunch of not found here, which is expected. So we pretty much have the perfect scenario to actually do DLL sideloading with Teams, right? Personally, I highly recommend that you override something that is not really quite useful, like user env. It's not going to break the functionality of the application, and you can actually sideload it. I'm not going to spend like 3 hours explaining you how to do side loadings. I will refer you to the episode where I did side loadings. I actually use Teams and user env as a demonstration of how you can actually do DLL side loading. But to be honest with you, these techniques work really well with most of the modern EDR, because you're using a trusted process to get your code execution. So they're never going to complain about whatever you do. And I really love Teams with modern EDR. Remember, we briefly touched on SMB beacon. I just wanted to kind of show you how you could implement your own little version of it using namepipe. This is actually super simple. A namepipe is a one-way or duplex pipe that provides communication between the pipe server and some pipe client, which means that you can read write to it both ways. It's built in Cobalt Strike. It's called SMB beacon. But if you're curious to see how it works, there's a bit of C code to do it. So if you have a client, all you have to do is actually write like to a normal file. The only difference is how you actually specify the path to it. Remember, I told you that it can be done remotely. If you use that, it's going to be yourself, but you can always specify a remote server. So if you want to create a little rat to actually rely on namepipe, you could do it. The only sad part of it is that you cannot do namepipe over the internet, but that will be nice if you can actually reach, a domain and have like all your C2 communication over name pipe, but that's not possible. That's purposely a limitation of it. And name pipe are technically in clear too, which is important to know. So yeah, you're just gonna create a file. This may be confusing, but create a file is the Windows API that just create an end-all to the file. It does not actually create the file itself. In this case, we're just asking to get an end-all on whatever we specify in the pipe name, and we want generate read-write, we want to share read-write so it doesn't lock, and you always like specify other arguments here. And if you want to write to a pipe, all you have to do is write file. So you write to a file like you will write to a normal file, and you just get the data on the other side. And if it was your client server typical stuff, well, instead of just showing what was written, you can actually execute it as a command, get the output, and write back to the source, right? So that's pretty much how it works. If you have your server, well, the only difference is instead of actually creating a file here, you're gonna call create name pipe. And this is where it's going to create the name pipe for you, so you can specify whatever name you want in here. You can always randomize it. Make sure that your client and server knows about the name, because it's going to have a hard time connecting to it if you don't know. And you can always specify the permission, so duplex or one way. Most of the time you're going to probably want to go with duplex. You can also, I think it's going to be over quit without name pipe. Ah, that's a good point, yeah. Quick, I forget about that. But yes, probably. That's a good point. There's a blog post about it. I remember reading about Quick, but I kind of forget what it is. In recent security on top of UDP, yeah, that's the UDP thing. Yeah. I guess time will tell, but it may be doable, which is nice, right? If we can do SMB over UDP. And that's the other thing too, most vendors don't monitor UDP too. So remember, not being trendy is a perfect example. That's probably a good, interesting vector that you can leverage. So quick over UDP, SMB, and having name pipe outbound is probably key to the success. So back to the name pipe, you actually just get an end-all, like a normal file, and you read and write to it. So you can just have a loop here that actually get information, do something, send it back to where it's coming from, and you're pretty much going to have a client server over name pipe. So it's really trivial to use. There's another cool thing about that too. As I pointed out in one of the sessions, you can use mail slot, because there is kernel callback for a create name pipe that can be monitored. ngirp create name pipe is one of them. So these are some of the kernel callback that are actually exposed by Microsoft. The idea here is that you can actually specify a callback on this, so every time a name pipe is created, the callback will actually receive notification about it, and you can actually do all kind of stuff. To kind of give you an idea here, you have a list of what can actually be monitored. Notice that create mail slot is also in there, but last time I checked, most of the EDR were not monitoring mail slot yet, but eventually if it's becoming popular, it will be the case. I should probably have a screenshot in there too. I have one with cross-right that show all the one that are monitoring. I can probably try to find the screenshot somewhere. Just give me a second. So this is pretty much what it looks like. As you can see here, you can guess which EDR it was. You can tell that there's a callback on all of these, because they actually set their own callback, and you get the address. So you can tell that this is the kernel driver, and this is the offset where the actual function is declared. So all of these are technically monitored by it, and you'll notice the lack of create mail slot in there. Some of them are also not in there just because they probably don't have any interest in doing it, but that's important to know that this is usually where they put their kernel callback. Yeah, it's not CobaltStrike agent, it's more CrowdStrike agent. But yeah. So this is something that we've mentioned quite a few times now. SOX proxy, quite useful if you want to tunnel your traffic. So all you have to do is set up the SOX proxy. It's pretty straightforward, right? You just set it up, and on your side you're gonna specify in your proxy chain whatever port you specify. Usually keep it at 9050 because that's the default one inside of proxy chain configuration. As I mentioned, if you're gonna tunnel traffic inside of the network, you may want to update the DNS for one of their internal DNS to make sure that it can resolve whatever you're gonna specify in there. There's multiple versions of proxy chain, like the NG version. I personally prefer the old one just because it's more verbose, and I love the fact that I can see what's going on under the hood and make sure that I can troubleshoot when some stuff time out when it should not. Just a fair warning. CobaltStrike is super slow because of the way that it's designed, right? Meter Predator SOX proxy is much faster because it's over raw TCP. CobaltStrike has the whole HTTP layer on top of it, which slow down the whole process. I don't know if this is something that you guys experienced, but personally I had a hard time sometimes dealing with it, and I just wanted to break everything around me because it was so slow, especially if you're trying to load a website where it fetch a bunch of resources and JavaScript that are like minify and 20 megabyte. Yeah, I gotta sleep 1, 2, 3. Yeah. So yeah, expect some delay, but at least you can connect to it, so it's always nice. Moving between forest and trust, that's the thing too. You have to not overlook trust. This is an example here. You can dump it with whatever product you want. In this case, I use my own little tools. Trust may actually be more exposed than you actually think, and this is a perfect example here of something that you think is actually secure, but it's not that secure. The idea here is that, let's say that you were actually inside of ring0.corp.com, right? So this is where all your users live. Technically, because you have a bidirectional trust, you're allowed to actually query information in corp.com. That's just how it works by design if it's a bidirectional trust. The issue here that you also have is that if you look at other trusts, let's say that they had a bunch of other stuff like Ring0Dev, from Corp you have full access to it, right? Because there's also a bidirectional trust, so you kind of inherit of whatever you get from Corp. So you may actually realize that sometimes you have layers of trust that allow you to get to some super secure environment, even if they're not intended to. And their point is like, yeah, but Corp doesn't super secure is only trusted and bound by corp.com, but because of the bidirectional trust here, you're kind of allowed to do it. So this is something that you should never overlook, right? Especially with companies that have a bunch of branches or a bunch of different locations because of acquisition. You may really be surprised of where you can get with an account on a different one. So always trying to connect to it. Personally, what I do is I'm trying to query domain controller on those domains to confirm that I have access to it, and usually when it works, it's working pretty well. So never underestimate the value of those trusts that you have in there. You may have noticed that most of my tools allow you to specify the domain on your target. A lot of people actually open pull requests or they ask me to actually make that automatically, and I always tell them that I'm not going to do it. The reason is very simple. It's exactly for that. I'd rather have the tools that allow me to specify which domain I want to target. So let's say here I'm inside of ring0corp.com. If I run something like dump trust, instead of specifying ring0, I could put supersecure.prod, and now I'm gonna get the result. If you hard code it, well, you can limit the visibility that you two have. But the reality, it's not because it's complex. Here's the one-liner C#. If you want to, have your own tool sets to get your current domain, it's really nothing special. It's just that I purposely wanted to avoid that. As I said, as a ring0 Charles, you could do something like that. LDAP utility, dump all users supersecure.prod because of the trust ship that you have in here. And you could also, reverse curve roast accounts in this super secure domain because of the trust ship relation that we have right now. So always give it a try. Sometimes I don't even bother dumping a trust. I'm just trying all of them to see if I can access them, but especially if it's small. But if you have like hundreds of them, you may probably want to check which kind of permission you have. So it's kind of a nested thing, but you'll get to the point where you may actually be able to move to different domain for us without even realizing that you have access to. and some of these may actually have weaker security, especially in cases where you have a dev environment where security is not a concern because it's a dev environment. So this is something really important to keep in mind. Lateral movement between those forests is quite interesting and important. Keep in mind that you need the DC IP for this super secure domain if you want to do anything special in there. You can always NS lookup that one too, and it's going to return you the list, or use the little C# utility that we rolled earlier today that allow you to actually dump all the information. It's going to provide you the exact same kind of result. Simply put, domain and forest trusts are extremely important for various reasons. One of them being Spoilerborg and Otterbug may actually be affected. I have several scenarios where I was able to actually trigger Pitspatam in different domain and forests. So never underestimate where you can get with that. And I'm also astonished that a lot of companies now allow 445 outbound. Back then it was something that you'll never see, but I highly suspect that it's because of the cloud. They have ADFS or anything like that, and they need to send some information over to the cloud, so it doesn't work, so they just end up punching a big hole where they allowed 445 outbound. This is something that I've done quite often, and unfortunately it brings a lot of good results. So if you can actually do it, just do it. There's no reason to not give it a try. Try with a public IP, have a responder set up in there, and you may actually capture a hash. I'd say that's worth probably 50% of the time for me. You can also abuse of the extra SID to, if you get domain admin in one domain, you can actually extra SID the other one and get privilege on the other domain. So these are other techniques that can be used. You can always check for foreign user inside of your own domain too. That's another thing, right? They may have, an IT environment, and they may be allowed to connect to you. So these may actually give you more privilege. And so every time you access a computer, especially if you see a user from another domain, these are probably interested because they were probably designed to be segregated from the environment, but because of the fact that you had access to a system, you may have access to them, and you may open the Pandora box if you manage to have a user in those other domain. And as I said, Pitspatam on other domain will probably yell a bunch of interesting stuff. And that's it. You made it, guys. You made it through the end of it. We're done. You survived. 12 out of 20 survived. I know that some of you are probably at bedtime right now, but you made it. So I guess that's it for me. That was the end of my Red Team training. It was made with a lot of love and effort. I honestly trying to do my best to provide as much information as provided. And as I mentioned, this training is focusing more on the knowledge in the lab, but you can probably build a little lab, as I pointed out at the beginning, which is, a VM or two, one domain controller, and you can do a lot. So now you can use all that knowledge and try to, do more and become a better red teamer at it. And I'm trying to vomit as much information as I can in a fairly small amount of time.